After embarrassing itself on the Ukrainian battlefield for most of 2022 and 2023, Russia seemed to turn things around in the first few months of 2024, taking advantage of the fact that the $61 billion Ukrainian military aid package from the US was stalled in Congress. The country finally managed to regain battlefield initiative and capture some key territories. The Ukrainian stronghold of Avdiivka fell under Russian control. The villages of Semenivka, Pervomaiska, and Novobakhmutivka followed suit. After fierce battles raging around Chaziv Yar, a city pivotal for Russian advances in the Donetsk Oblast, Russia managed to capture parts of it. The Ukrainian forces started retreating from several areas of the Donbass after being badly outgunned and outmanned by their Russian foes. In other words, everything was falling into place for Russia. So you'd think that Russian President Vladimir Putin would be pretty confident and secure in his position, right? Wrong. It's quite the opposite, really. As July was nearing its end, Putin was in full panic mode. For the first time since the invasion of Ukraine started on February 24, 2022, one realization seems to have started settling in. Russia may have lost the war in Ukraine. But how did we get here? What caused Putin, a man known for his ruthless calculation and steely resolve, to face such crushing dread? And how did Russia go from seeming triumph to the precipice of defeat? We've got all the answers for you in this video. After hearing that Putin is in full panic mode, you might understandably ask a single question. How do you know that? After all, it's not like Putin is likely to broadcast his fears for the world to see. Well, the truth is that actions often speak louder than words. And even the words used often reek of desperation and fear, even though they're meant to project power. As hard as Russia is trying to keep this facade of strength, the cracks are beginning to show. So before examining what made Putin go into full panic mode, let's take a closer look at the key signs of his crumbling confidence. Putin's shocking cabinet reshuffle in May of 2024 was the first major sign that he felt his grip on power weakening. In a move that sent shockwaves around the globe, Putin replaced his long-standing Minister of Defense and longtime friend and close ally, Sergei Shoigu, with an economist with no military experience, Andrei Belousov. Now, for the most part, this move was seen as the most obvious sign that Russia was placing its economy on a war footing, preparing for a long war in Ukraine and beyond. But beneath the surface, this reshuffle signaled more than just an economic pivot. It signaled that Putin's worst fear, the rise of his Kremlin rivals, was potentially becoming a reality once again. And after the disastrous impact of Yevgeny Prigozhin's June 2023 rebellion, Putin couldn't take any chances. By removing Shoigu from his post, Putin effectively neutralized an ally who became a little too powerful for Putin's liking. Most Russians perceived Shoigu as a familiar and respected minister who had served Russia honorably for 12 years. Putin also believed this before the invasion of Ukraine, sharing quite a close and public friendship with Shoigu. But as the situation in Ukraine worsened, the Russian public had to bid farewell to the many macho photos of Putin and Shoigu sunbathing bare-chested in Siberia, going on fishing trips and playing hockey. The choice between friendship and power proved to be an easy one for Putin. And that's precisely what the Russian political scientist Mikhail Sava believes Putin achieved by removing Shoigu from his cabinet. He removed any threat to his power. Shoigu's replacement, Belousov, described as a trustworthy bureaucrat, is only interested in economic matters. He has no ambitions to lead the Russian armed forces, build a parallel power base, or even meddle in important military issues. The general staff of the Russian armed forces will be in charge of those, while Belousov focuses on securing the necessary funding for Russia's war machine. Belousov also doesn't have a loyal base of supporters like Shoigu. He's just a scientist who owes his position to Putin alone, and thus Putin alone warrants his loyalty. To secure this loyalty from other key figures in the cabinet, Putin started appointing their children to high-profile positions and lucrative state contracts. So Dmitry Patrushev, the son of Nikolai Patrushev, who many consider to be the second most powerful man in Russia, was appointed Deputy Prime Minister for Agriculture. Similarly, Boris Kovalchuk, the son of Yuri Kovalchuk, reputed to be Putin's personal banker, became the chairman of the Accounts Chamber of Russia. Through these moves, Putin is also securing the loyalty of the next generation of political leaders, eliminating future threats to his regime. Of course, there are no guarantees in the cruel world of politics, as Prigozhin proved, so Putin's efforts to fortify his position are fraught with risk. But even if they weren't, even if they were rock solid, the mere fact that Putin was forced to make these moves speaks volumes about his current state of mind. So do Putin's threats of nuclear war. Now, we know what you're thinking, old news. And yes, Putin has been threatening to deploy nuclear weapons virtually since the beginning of the Ukrainian invasion. However, the threats and this dangerous rhetoric dramatically intensified in the last few months, clearly showing just how desperate and panicked Putin is. In an effort to convince the world he isn't bluffing once again, he reiterated that Russia would use all means at its disposal to protect its sovereignty at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. He added, "For some reason, the West believes that Russia will never use it," conveniently ignoring the very reason for this belief is his history of making empty threats and nuclear saber-rattling. Of course, Russian officials, state media, and publications are quick to take Putin's word for it, plastering nuclear threats across headlines and broadcasting them with fervor. But these threats aren't the only outlandish thing the Russian media keeps pushing. Believe it or not, Russia's state-controlled media outlets are now trying to convince Russian people to join the war by promising them that they will be resurrected if they get killed on the battlefield. Yep, you heard that right. The state media is also painting Russia's invasion as a holy war, presenting the Russian armed forces as the embodiment of the forces of good and describing individual soldiers as the forerunners of Jesus' forces. It's a lethal mix of delusion and desperation. However, in actuality, the desperation in this department is quite justified, given how many troops Russia has lost in Ukraine. According to the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces, Russia has lost as many as 570,120 troops. Combine this staggering number of casualties with the two waves of forced mobilization, 137,000 troops in August 2022 and 170,000 troops in December 2023, combined with the 300,000 Russian citizens who had fled the country, and it becomes obvious that the Kremlin is facing a dire manpower crisis. The fact that he's gradually running out of soldiers to send to certain death might have contributed to Putin's apparent readiness to hold peace talks, announced on June 14th. While this would surely be monumental news coming from any other warring leader, in Putin's case it's tinged with skepticism, especially when the terms Putin proposes for this peace initiative heavily favor Russia's strategic interests rather than offering any genuine concessions. According to him, fighting would stop if Ukraine would withdraw its troops from the territories of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia oblasts and refuse to join NATO. Ukraine, on its part, slammed this proposition as an ultimatum, labeling his options for ending the war as absurd. Dmytro Kuleba, Ukraine's Minister of Foreign Affairs, also added that these statements contained nothing new. But Minister Kuleba is wrong. There is something new in Putin's June 14th statement, a hint of desperation. Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte was the first to point this out publicly. During the Global Peace Summit in Switzerland, Rutte said that Putin's alleged readiness to hold peace talks indicates that he's panicking. His exact words were, "Obviously, since he came up with this crazy proposal for peace yesterday, it shows us that he's panicking." However, Rutte still seems to believe peace is possible for the war in Ukraine and that it could be achieved at a similar summit. In fact, the Dutch official voiced his disappointment over Putin not attending the June 2024 summit in Switzerland, saying, "The train will not move without Russia." To be fair, Russia and Putin weren't invited to attend the Global Peace Summit, which ended up hosting about 100 delegations with 57 heads of state and governments from all over the world. However, the reason why Russia wasn't invited was the country's public flagging that it would not participate. But even if it did, it would hardly change anything. Putin needs the war in Ukraine to continue for his regime to survive. If the war comes to an end, regardless of the side that prevails, he will be left to grapple with the disastrous consequences of his war economy that Russians will no longer be able to ignore. Then again, Russians are already starting to catch on, despite the relentless propaganda keeping them in the dark. And they have a single item to thank, the first reason on our list for Putin to panic: eggs. That's right, eggs have come to symbolize the economic turmoil in Russia. They've become so expensive that they're even sold individually in some shops, going for as high as 23 cents an egg. Of course, they aren't alone, with numerous other basic ingredients soaring in price due to massive labor market shortages, high energy costs, and the plunging ruble. The situation has gotten so dire that Putin fears Russians might take to the streets to protest. This is also the first of many occurrences that set off Putin's panic mode, which we'll discuss in this video. In the same way Putin fears the rise of Kremlin rivals, he also fears the power of public unrest. That's why his regime ordered the Russian security services to take action and finally address the shocking prices and shortage of eggs and other staples. Russia is even resorting to importing eggs from Turkey and Azerbaijan to fill the gap, a stark contrast to the 98% of nationally sourced eggs before the war. Of course, eggs are far from the only reason why Putin is in full panic mode, and far from the most crucial one. That honor belongs to the second reason on our list, which is that Ukraine is now allowed to use Western-supplied weapons to strike targets on Russian soil. This monumental decision came in May 2024, when ally after ally started giving Ukraine the green light on the matter, instantly sending Putin into full panic mode. You see, before May, Ukraine was only allowed to use Western-supplied weapons on Russian targets within Ukrainian territory, that is, the parts occupied by Russia. This allowed Russia to wreak havoc all across Ukraine, while Ukraine was only allowed to respond within the confines of its own borders. With this new change of policy, Ukraine can use a wide variety of advanced weaponry to strike Russian targets beyond the occupied Ukrainian regions. However, there's also a major but involved. Ukraine can target Russian territory, but only within specific areas and military targets. For instance, the Russian armed forces launched a massive offensive in the Kharkiv region on May 10th, so the US allowed Ukraine to hit the Russian targets surrounding this border region, which were heavily involved in carrying out this offensive. Other countries like France, Germany, and the UK followed suit, allowing Ukraine to do the same with the weapons they supplied. But what kinds of weapons are we talking about here? Well, Ukraine can use most of its air defense systems, rockets, and artillery. Long-range missiles are still off-limits, but this new policy shift opens up a range of high-impact options. To be more specific, Ukraine can now use the following weapons and equipment to strike predefined targets in Russia: the F-16 Fighting Falcon fighter jet supplied by the Netherlands and Denmark, Su-25 close air support jets donated by Northern Macedonia, Scalp Egg air-launched cruise missiles supplied by France, Storm Shadow air-launched cruise missiles delivered by the UK, the Bayraktar TB2 unmanned combat aerial vehicles provided by Turkey, and HIMARS and ATACMS missiles supplied by Germany, the US, UK, and Norway. Of course, the permission to use these weapons on Russian soil alone is by no means enough for Ukraine to win the war. However, it's more than enough to finally shift the balance of power and give Russia the taste of its own medicine. As an anonymous senior Ukrainian officer put it in a call with CNN, the Russian military can no longer feel impunity and security. The newly granted permission has already had a huge impact, allowing Ukraine to destroy several important targets inside Russia and conduct a successful counteroffensive. It's also stopped Russia from targeting the Kharkiv region with its S-300 and S-400 systems. How so? Ukraine started carrying out strikes on targets in the Belgorod region using the HIMARS missiles, which forced the Russians to move their surface-to-air missile systems much further away, putting ground targets in Kharkiv out of their range, that range being 75 miles for the S-300 system and 120 miles for its S-400 counterparts. As for the aerial targets like aircraft and missiles, both systems have an operational range of 250 miles. When struck by Ukrainian HIMARS, these systems were located roughly 40 miles from the front line in the Kharkiv region and 50 miles from the city of Kharkiv itself. Safeguarding Kharkiv from the S-300 threat has provided significant relief to the city of Kharkiv, which is also targeted by aerial glide bombs dropped from fighter jets from a distance of some 40 miles. However, there's one particular target that seems to be inducing the most panic in the Kremlin: the Crimean Bridge. As its name suggests, the 12-mile bridge is located on the Crimean Peninsula and serves as a crucial artery connecting the peninsula to mainland Russia. Since its construction in 2018, this bridge, also known as the Kerch Strait Bridge, has facilitated the movement of Russian troops, supplies, and resources between the peninsula and the mainland. However, the bridge has also served as a symbol of Russian control and a testament to Moscow's claims over Crimea, which makes it one of the prime targets for Ukrainian forces. So far, Ukraine has managed to hit the bridge twice, in October 2022 and July 2023. Both times, strike drones were involved in the attack. While these strikes managed to badly damage parts of the bridge, they failed to achieve Ukraine's ultimate goal, completely severing Russia's crucial supply line to Crimea. But the newly delivered ATACMS, a coveted long-range missile system manufactured in the US with a range of up to 190 miles, could change this. That's why the renewed flow of military aid from the US to Ukraine is another source of panic for Putin and the Kremlin, the third on our list. But how do we know Ukraine is eyeing the Crimean Bridge? Well, besides the obvious strategic value of this bridge, a senior Ukrainian diplomat has also dropped a major hint. In a post shared to X, formerly Twitter, Sergei Kyslytsya, Ukraine's permanent representative in the United Nations, listed 6 main types of bridges. Each of the types was accompanied by a diagram showing what the bridge type looks like. But in the 6th slot, there weren't any bridges, just an empty space with the words Kerch. For those who can read between the lines, the message was more than clear. The Kerch Bridge will be no more. The fourth reason for Putin's justified panic is the overall change in how the West approaches the war. For the better part of almost 30 months of warfare, the US and Western allies weren't going all in to help Ukraine. First, the West was wary of provoking Russia too much, fearing the escalation that might ensue. It's almost as if Ukraine wasn't allowed to win the war because of what a Russian loss might mean for the rest of Europe. Next, the West was seemingly hoping Putin would stop at some point, realizing that his aggressive expansionism would ultimately be unsustainable and self-defeating. This is also partially why the US waited for so long before greenlighting the use of its weapons inside Russia. Think of it this way: Ukraine doesn't want the war to continue. The US doesn't want the war to continue. NATO doesn't want the war to continue. And the rest of the world doesn't want the war to continue. It was only logical to assume that Russia could also be added to that list. Unfortunately, it became evident that Putin had no intention of stopping. In addition, he's obviously looking to expand the war beyond the Ukrainian borders. As a result, the West finally realized that a change of tactics was more than necessary. So the strategy is no longer Russia can't lose and Ukraine can't win. The strategy is now Ukraine will win the war. Ukrainian armed forces have seemingly sensed the change, lending them to fight more valiantly than ever. This leads us to the fifth source of Putin's panic: Ukraine's everlasting resilience. Even though Ukrainian forces are the ones heavily outgunned and outnumbered, the Russian troops are the ones taking more hits. According to Alexander Syrsky, the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian armed forces, Russia suffers 3 times the number of casualties than Ukraine. In some areas, this ratio is even higher. Russia has also suffered heavy equipment losses since the beginning of the invasion. According to the July 24th report from the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces, Russia has lost the following equipment in the war: 8,302 tanks, 16,013 armored fighting vehicles, 21,279 vehicles and fuel tanks, 15,759 artillery systems, 1,125 multiple launch rocket systems, 902 air defense systems, 363 airplanes, 326 helicopters, 12,544 drones, 28 ships and boats, 1 submarine. Of course, Ukraine has suffered heavy losses in this department as well, but not before taking full advantage of the equipment. For instance, a UK-based think tank, the Royal United Services Institute, estimated that Ukraine loses a staggering 10,000 drones monthly, but this high figure has to do with Ukraine's aggressive use of drones in combat roles. Simply put, Ukrainian drones have been wreaking havoc on Russia. They are the reason the Black Sea Fleet has all but retreated from Crimea, despite standing against a country that has virtually no navy. Ukraine has also been using drones to sow panic and fear across Russia, wiping out major targets in the process. The targets in question are mostly air bases, oil depots, and industrial sites. In other words, locations whose destruction can disrupt Putin's relentless war machine. In one of the latest attacks, 47 drones targeted the Rostov region, badly damaging the Morozovsk air base, home to various Russian fighter jets, including Su-34s, Su-24s, and Su-24Ms. The 5 areas that were hit were the location of an S-300-400 air defense system, the parking area of an Su-24 fighter jet, another parking area for fighter jets, a fuel and lubricants warehouse, and the runway. With strategic moves aimed at appeasing the people of Russia and its government, it's clear that Ukraine remains the biggest threat to the survival of Putin's regime. After all, we're talking about a man who takes out his opponents almost preemptively before they get a real chance to threaten his grip on power. Think Boris Nemtsov and Alexei Navalny. So the fact that this great enemy of Russia, Ukraine, just won't relent and continues to challenge his authority is a source of profound anxiety for Putin. The same goes for his many miscalculations in the war in Ukraine, the sixth source of panic. Remember, the very invasion of Ukraine was launched based on a miscalculation. Putin's yes men promised him that he could take Kyiv in 3 days or so after swarming it with 190,000 troops and tens of thousands of vehicles. Of course, this didn't happen. Kyiv is still very much standing. Since the beginning of the invasion, there has been one miscalculation after another, and even Putin, despite his usual arrogance, can't ignore the mounting evidence of his errors. Speaking of his miscalculations, another international one is sure to make Putin sweat: Joe Biden dropping out of the 2024 US presidential race. You see, Putin was all but convinced that Donald Trump would get re-elected in November, as his opponent was widely painted as an old and sickly man who can't be trusted to lead the most powerful nation in the world. Of course, this worked in Putin's favor, as Trump famously promised to shake up NATO, even threatening to pull the US from the alliance altogether. With a weakened NATO, Putin would have little trouble advancing his strategic ambitions, both in Ukraine and beyond. But Putin's dreams of an easy path to victory were shattered on July 21, 2024, when it was announced that Biden would no longer run for re-election and that he endorsed his vice president, Kamala Harris, as his replacement. The news stirred up quite the commotion in the US and the rest of the world, Russia very much included. Russian state officials started complaining on national TV that Biden's move was a disaster for Trump's re-election chances. As Oleg Matveyev, a member of the State Duma, put it, previously, Trump could easily attack Biden's health. Now he has nothing left to attack. He added that Trump's campaign switched to attacking Harris, but nothing new will stick to her. Of course, the US presidential race is far from over, but it's easy to see why Putin and those around him are panicking. If elected, Harris's policy toward Ukraine is likely to remain similar to Biden's, which means support for as long as it takes. Harris has previously attended 3 consecutive Munich security conferences, meeting with Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky at each. Though her first appearance was 5 days before the full-scale invasion started, Harris used the other 2 meetings with Zelensky to reiterate US support for Ukraine. Harris has also continuously reiterated that Russia must pay for its war crimes, which shouldn't be surprising given her background as Attorney General. She also insists that the only way for the war in Ukraine to end is with Ukraine as a nation that is free, democratic, and independent. So there you have it. Putin's full panic mode now makes much more sense, doesn't it? But the good news is that the West still has a few cards up its sleeve, which could easily push Putin into an even deeper state of desperation. The first is to allow Ukraine to hit more targets using Western-supplied weapons. Though lifting all limitations is the ultimate goal, even a simple expansion beyond areas directly targeting Ukraine would do wonders for the country's war effort. Ideally, Ukraine should be able to hit Moscow, because there's no more important city in the entire country. Russia is Moscow, and Moscow is Russia. For now, the people of Moscow are mostly unaware of the war raging some 500 miles away. Sure, they've experienced the fluctuating economy, but they have no idea of the full scale of devastation and chaos unfolding in Ukraine. The Russian elites were a bit shaken when the war first started, but by now they're used to it, giving it no second thought in their day-to-day lives. So the only way to truly get to Putin is to make Russia feel the war. As the Ukrainian historian Yuri Felshtinsky puts it, Felshtinsky believes that it's also the only way to ultimately defeat Russia and prevent further escalation. The West, and the US in particular, can also instill more fear in Putin by providing additional military aid to Ukraine. After all, in the 5 months when US aid was withheld was when Russia turned the tables. Ukrainian soldiers on the front lines are vocal about the massive impact this aid has. In the words of an officer with the 148th Artillery Brigade, we can see the impact of the aid every day. Artillery, longer-range multiple-launch rocket systems with various types of ammunition and submunitions, it's affecting the overall battlefield picture. The last thing that the West can do to make Putin sweat doesn't have anything to do directly with Ukraine. It refers to changing the regime in Belarus, Russia's only remaining ally in the region. While Alexander Lukashenko is in power, Putin will continue using Belarus as a starting point for his military operations in the region, potentially advancing against the entirety of Europe. Recently, Putin even moved part of Russia's tactical nuclear weapons arsenal to Belarus, suggesting that the first nuclear strikes could be launched from this territory. Defeating Putin while the war is still limited to only Ukraine is the only way to prevent a World War III-like escalation, and taking Lukashenko out of the picture would certainly help achieve that goal. Of course, there's always the question of what Putin will do if he's backed into a corner. As of 2024, Russia possesses 5,850 nuclear warheads, the most in the world, which is why a nuclear war is the first thing to come to mind when thinking of a potential escalation. It doesn't help that Putin has been rather cavalier about the potential use of these weapons, leaving the rest of the world in just as much panic as he's currently experiencing. But what do you think? Is there a way to push Putin to the edge without provoking World War III? And if so, what do you think will be the straw that breaks the camel's back? After more than 1,000 days of fighting, both Ukraine and Russia are desperate for a way to end the war. Ukraine may already have the upper hand. Their invasion of the Kursk region in August left Russia scrambling to recover, a blow Moscow still hasn't come back from. But Ukraine isn't stopping there. In one of his last big decisions before leaving office, President Joe Biden approved Ukraine's use of US-supplied ATACMS missiles to hit targets deep inside Russia. Ukraine didn't hesitate, launching a strike on a weapons facility in Bryansk. Only one missile caused damage, but the message was loud and clear. Ukraine is ready to strike at the heart of Russia. For Putin, it's a nightmare. Trapped and losing ground, he's turning to his most dangerous play yet, threatening nuclear war. Putin has rewritten Russia's nuclear policies, creating a way to justify using nukes against Ukraine. It's a desperate move, showing just how far he's willing to go to avoid defeat. But would he actually press the button? And what does this say about the state of the war? Let's dive into Putin's nuclear gamble and why his threats are more alarming than ever. The most recent change to Russia's nuclear deterrence and defense policy before the start of the Ukraine war came 4 years ago with the 2020 Basic Principles of State Policy of the Russian Federation on Nuclear Deterrence. Briefly stated, the bulk of the policy underlined how Russia could justify using nuclear weapons to ensure the country's sovereignty and territorial integrity. The doctrine also outlined 4 possible scenarios under which Russia would use nuclear weaponry. The first was direct evidence of a ballistic missile en route to Russian territory or that of its allies, which would constitute a direct attack on Russia or its allies by a country with its own ballistic missile capabilities. Note that the wording of this scenario specifically doesn't refer to a ballistic missile carrying a nuclear warhead, nor does it specify the type of ballistic missile used for the attack, which means an ordinary ballistic missile would qualify for retaliation. The second condition was the use of nuclear weaponry or other types of weapons of mass destruction against Russia or its allies, ostensibly by another nuclear-capable country. The third is an attack on Russian nuclear weapons and arsenal infrastructure, including storage, command, and communication centers. These two would likely be triggered in the event of a nuclear war, where Russia would be one of the targets of a first strike designed to cripple and disable the country's nuclear weapons and prevent retaliation. Of course, in these cases, there's a possibility that nuclear war was already on the horizon, and the other nuclear-capable countries have similar deterrence policies in place. But it's the fourth condition that brought the most criticism. It cited the possibility of nuclear retaliation for using conventional weapons that threatened the very existence of the country. The wording of this condition was remarkably vague, as there was no set standard on what constituted that level of danger to the country. However, the message was much less ambiguous, suggesting that Russia could, and most likely would, use nuclear weaponry when it felt threatened. And there was yet another aspect of the nuclear doctrine that one could discover if they looked at the specific language of the fourth general provision. This provision states that in the event of a military conflict, Russia's policy allows for the prevention of an escalation of military actions and their termination on conditions that are acceptable for the Russian Federation and/or its allies. This wording, along with discussions in Russian defense circles, suggests that Russia sees its nuclear weapons as a tool not just for survival, but for coercion. Even in a conventional conflict, Russia could use the threat of nuclear escalation to bully its opponent into submission, all the while claiming that the terms of the conflict endangered its existence enough to justify such a move. At the time it was altered, the changes in the nuclear deterrence policy might not have made the rounds across news channels. But that changed with the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Between February 2022 and October 2024, the Center for Strategic and International Studies counted over 200 instances of Russia referring to the fourth general provision of its nuclear doctrine. These references suggested that Russia might use nuclear weapons not only for survival, but as a coercive tool to end the war in Ukraine on favorable terms to Moscow and its allies. The strategy of saber-rattling, while generally considered underhanded, did bear some fruit, as significant amounts of NATO military donations to Ukraine were delayed for months once Putin or other prominent Russian politicians or ministers threatened a nuclear response. But eventually, most other nations seemed to agree that Russia's nuclear saber-rattling was only empty threats, at least for the first 2.5 years of the war. This meant that NATO started ignoring Russian military theorists' claims of escalating to de-escalate the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, while countries that have a more positive relationship with Russia, such as China and India, pressured Putin into not making any extremely offensive moves, both with ulterior motives that guided them to present themselves as more or less neutral in the conflict. And then, August 2024 rolled around. In an unprecedented move in the war, Ukraine turned the tide and invaded Russian territory. The 3-week campaign in the Kursk region led to the Ukrainian military managing to occupy more territory in Russia than Russia had done in Donbass over the preceding 7 months. The widespread success of the invasion of Kursk had several consequences, all of which would end up degrading Russia's influence as one of the biggest and most powerful militaries in the world. But there were 2 consequences that were arguably the most important. First, the Ukrainian military managed to put Russia on the defensive for the first time. The success of the Kursk invasion showed that for all its numerical advantages, the Russian military relied on stringent and stiff tactics to make progress. When faced with a sudden change in the tide of the war, as with what happened in Kursk, the Russian command initially stammered and failed to mount a decisive response. This was due to a few factors. The bulk of the soldiers that Russia stationed in the region weren't contract soldiers but conscripts, at least according to the statistics posted by the Ukrainian prisons that were processing the captured Russians. The conscripts didn't have enough training, experience, or detailed orders to provide meaningful resistance to the invading army. This led to waves of surrenders across the region, which was partially why the invasion was considered such a resounding success for Ukraine in the first place. Then, the Kremlin was extremely slow to respond to the invasion, with initial reports in Russia falsely suggesting that the invaders were already being repelled by local forces. When that was found to be entirely wrong, the Russian military resorted to more defensive tactics, creating trenches that proved to be only partially successful in slowing down the Ukrainian advance. Ultimately, Russia would only begin the counteroffensive in Kursk in early September, nearly a full month after the Ukrainian soldiers first set foot in the region. And Russia's progress in the region seems to be agonizingly slow. According to Russian news outlets, the military has managed to regain control of only roughly half of the 500 square miles of territory that Ukraine occupied by mid-October. Meanwhile, Ukrainian sources claimed that the Russian counteroffensive only managed to retake 40% of the initial territory. The truth was probably somewhere in the middle. The most recent reports from the BBC on November 20th suggest the same statistics as the first Russian report. Regardless, the conflicting reports indicate that even if Russia managed to retake half of the territory within the first month and a half, it's had increasing difficulties in making the final push. But the second, arguably biggest consequence of the Kursk invasion was that Ukraine has technically managed to cross one of the so-called nuclear red lines. These red lines were frequently mentioned in the Kremlin's rhetoric as potential justifications for Russia deploying its nuclear weapons. As previously mentioned, some of the most common red lines that were drawn by the Russian authorities pertain to the types of weaponry being donated to Ukraine, starting with Soviet-era tanks to more modern armor. All of these red lines ended up being crossed as NATO sent increasingly technologically potent tanks to Ukraine, from T-80s to M1 Abrams, Challenger 2s and Leopard 2s. Other red lines included sending F-16s to Ukraine. Moscow's warnings only briefly delayed NATO in donating these aircraft, and they eventually started flying for the Ukrainian Air Force in August. The red line that related to the Kursk invasion addressed what would happen if Ukraine or another country invaded Russia's territory. Ukraine, however, managed to do so without any involvement from the West. At the time, Putin labeled the invading forces as terrorists. Additionally, he called on the ambiguous defense pact with North Korea to justify having the latter send up to 12,000 soldiers to Kursk, all in the name of defending Russia's territorial integrity against the Ukrainian invasion. The North Korean soldiers presumably still have a few more months of training before they can be fully deployed in Kursk and other neighboring regions. The wording of the defense pact suggests that North Korea will be of limited use to Russia offensively, but it could also allow Putin to redouble his counteroffensive efforts in Kursk. Arguably, Russia could have used the invasion of Kursk as a red line to justify firing nuclear weapons into Ukraine, particularly when the invasion turned out to be more extensive than the Kremlin anticipated. After all, Ukraine occupying a piece of Russian territory gives it significantly more bargaining chips for the eventual peace talks, something that is becoming a far likelier event than Russia winning the war in Ukraine in the next year or two. So when nuclear bombs weren't deployed as a response to the Kursk invasion, the West saw it as an opportunity to become bolder in its military donations. The US approved more rounds of both financial and military aid, including sending more ammo for the Patriot anti-air defense system, alongside a second Patriot launch battery allocated to Ukraine in June 2024. The increasing Western support was exactly what Ukraine needed at the time, as elevated media attention refocused the world's view on the war in Ukraine, allowing them to advocate for more aid efforts. The advancing support seemingly culminated in the US finally agreeing to let Ukraine use some of the long-range missiles they donated to be fired into Russian territory. This was yet another of Russia's red lines crossed, and one that was a more direct retaliation, albeit not at the level of a nuclear response. There were a few different reasons why the US approved the use of ATACMS inside Russia. Let's start with a less obvious but perhaps more logical one. Ukraine already had the means to strike deeper into Russia. In addition to the Kursk invasion, Ukraine started ramping up its ability to strike key military targets in Russia through the use of kamikaze drones, which were either repurposed commercial drones for short-range missions or dedicated military drones for long-range ones. While the former has practically transformed the usual decades-long military tactics on the front lines, the latter was a direct result of years of Ukraine's own domestic weapons advancements. In September, long-range drone missions became more ambitious, culminating in a large-scale drone attack that targeted the Russian capital of Moscow on September 10th. While most of the 140-odd drones were intercepted and destroyed by Russian defenses, several drones still managed to strike close to the capital and resulted in a casualty. The ramifications were sudden and clear. Ukraine could build drones that challenged Russia's defenses and worked over long distances that made previous tactics redundant. With Ukraine's burgeoning drone industry and reliance on drone warfare tactics, ATACMS presents somewhat of a redundancy or a side grade to Ukraine's plans. First, ATACMS missiles aren't that long range to begin with, topping out at roughly 200 miles, which is less than the distance from Ukraine to Moscow. Secondly, they are much more expensive to produce than military drones. A military drone at the level of the ones that were used by Ukraine can cost roughly $100,000 to $200,000, while a single ATACMS missile costs over $1 million. Thirdly, Ukraine doesn't have a way to manufacture ATACMS missiles, and its entire supply is based on donations from NATO. This is a supply that's extremely limited at the moment, with indications that Ukraine received no more than 50 missiles over the course of the entire war and no exact way to determine how many are left. But where ATACMS missiles are superior is their ability to bypass modern defensive systems. With the missile being significantly faster than military drones, the Russian anti-air defenses have their work cut out for them for longer-range strikes. Of course, the most recent result of 5 out of 6 missiles fired being destroyed by Russian anti-missile defenses doesn't give much of a boost of confidence in using ATACMS for offensive purposes, but there's no telling whether that trend will continue. Regardless, Ukraine could theoretically use the missiles to disrupt key supply chain operations around Russia, which would ultimately allow Ukrainian drones to focus on launching other attacks on vital command and military centers. So ATACMS might be arriving a bit too late to make a significant difference considering the current state of the war, but there's another, more vital reason why so many decisions regarding where and how to attack are being made at this time. The Biden administration is on its way out. With former President Donald Trump winning the 2024 presidential election and set to be inaugurated on January 20, 2025, the current administration has a deadline of less than 2 months left to continue to aid Ukraine. After that, it's Trump's turn to make the decisions, which could overturn many of the Biden policies that were made over the past 1,000 days. And NATO, Ukraine, and Russia all know this, which is precisely why the war has ramped up over the past few weeks. With Russia unable to make significant headway in Kursk, North Korean soldiers still in the final stages of training, and no real justification to use nuclear weapons over an invasion that happened months ago, Putin has turned his sights to the active front line in Donbass. There, the Russian military has started to make slow but steady progress, occupying roughly 1,000 square miles of territory in 2024, which is significantly more progress than in the previous year. Even more importantly for Putin, the offensive might be accelerating as the newly occupied territories represent only 656 square miles acquired by September, with half of that progress made in only 3 months. So why is there suddenly worry about using nuclear weapons? The ATACMS being used to attack Russian territory came before Russia overhauled its nuclear defense policy. Unlike the 2020 doctrine, the new wording of the policy implies that Ukraine using third-party weaponry from a nuclear-capable country, such as the US, is considered the same as that third-party country directly attacking Russia. In short, the new policy is precisely worded to create a new round of saber-rattling that directly counters new developments in NATO policies, permitting what Ukraine can do with its weapons. Secondly, the revised doctrine now more broadly refers to detections of aerospace attacks rather than ballistic missile attacks. The term aerospace in this way can either mean missiles, drones, or aircraft, casting a hilariously wide net to cover pretty much any type of option that Ukraine has for conducting long-range strikes. While the Kremlin has officially stated that the new doctrine was carefully reviewed independently of ongoing developments in the war, the wording and how it matches the war efforts say otherwise. Regardless, it would seem that Russia is not yet done with its attempts to saber-rattle Ukraine and NATO into delaying further military aid or reversing some of these policies. The January 20th deadline might seem to be working in Putin's favor, but the reality is slightly more complex. While Trump was significantly more agreeable to Putin's geopolitical goals during his first presidency, there's no telling how he would act in his second term. For one, NATO has shored up many of its apparent weaknesses, with most countries going above the recommended spending levels of 2% of GDP. Meanwhile, countries such as Germany, Poland, and Finland have made significant headway toward modernizing or bolstering their military technology or numbers. Secondly, Trump's deference to Russia's war efforts likely was based on their projecting power, but with how the war in Ukraine has been going, this might not be the case any longer. Remember, Ukraine started the war by having 1/5 of Russia's active manpower and about 1/10 of its military equipment, which included equipment that was considered older than Russia's. But despite that, Ukraine has managed to repel Russia for much longer than was considered possible in 2022, to the shock of experts and strategists. With NATO support, there's even a possibility of a full-blown Ukrainian victory. This might mean that Trump may actually force Russia and Ukraine to sit for peace talks shortly after he's inaugurated. In that scenario, Ukraine holding Russian territory distinctly works against Putin, as it presents a meaningful weak point for Russian negotiators. So Putin might be inclined to use the renewed nuclear doctrine as an offensive weapon more than before. While previous mentions of using nuclear weapons were done in the context of Russia defending its territory, there's now a possibility, however slight, that Putin might decide to use them to attack Ukraine. How? Well, consider how nuclear weapons were used for the first time in 1945. Japan was on the brink of defeat in conventional warfare, with its sizable navy suffering extreme losses from the US and its allies, yet Japan refused to surrender to the US. That is, until the bombs were dropped. The deployment of the nuclear bombs had 3 distinct effects on the then current state of World War II. First, it basically forced Japan to surrender, effectively ending the war globally. Secondly, the bombs precluded a more deadly naval invasion of Japan, significantly speeding up the course of the war and possibly saving several hundred thousands of soldiers. Thirdly, the bombings sent a clear message to the Soviet Union concerning American advances in weapons technology and capability. Russia's use of nuclear weapons on Ukraine could, they would hope, essentially achieve the same effects on Ukraine and NATO. This is perhaps one of the main reasons why the Russian military has only increased its offensive efforts in Donbass. With the bulk of the Russian and Ukrainian forces focused on reinforcing the front, Putin might consider dropping a nuclear bomb on a city farther away from the front and deeper into Ukrainian territory. The effect would be similar to the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Ukraine would lose a large population center and probably one of their main supply lines to the front. Then, with prospects of further bombing on the table, as Russia currently fields close to 1,700 nuclear warheads in active duty, Ukraine would be forced to surrender. Similarly, NATO could see the use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine as the start of a lost cause and cede to whatever terms Russia imposes and try to create a new status quo where NATO and Russia redraw the boundaries in Eastern Europe. Even for Russia, the prospect of nuking a single city might be considered an acceptable cost. After all, recently increased conventional shelling, missile strikes, and drone attacks have practically leveled entire neighborhoods, so a low-yield nuclear bomb would only replicate that devastation. Additionally, Russia and Ukraine have extensive experience cleaning up radioactive contamination following the Chernobyl disaster, so Russia could rebuild the cities and use them for industrial purposes it clearly needs them for. Thus, Russia could end up using the nuclear defense policy to conduct offensive warfare instead. But this scenario rests on Russia continuing to make advances in Ukraine. While the Russian military did double its gains in Donbass for 2024 over only 3 months, Ukrainians using ATACMS to strike at supply lines could counter that. Additionally, Biden's administration could very well be planning more aggressive military donations. Short of NATO deploying its own troops in Ukraine, which is another red line that would likely get an immediate widespread response and possibly escalate the war into World War III, Western European countries could start donating more advanced weaponry and equipment than before. Instead of F-16s, Ukraine might receive F-22s and F-35s. The US might start donating significantly larger numbers of Patriot defense systems and ammunition, alongside more ATACMS for both defensive and offensive missions. In addition, the prototypes that Finland has been sending to Ukraine over the past year could start getting actively deployed in larger numbers. On the other side, China has gained significantly more influence over Russia since the war began, being one of its largest trading and economic partners. While China has proposed multiple peace plans, neither has specifically addressed the status of the territory Russia has occupied, leading to criticism for their ambiguity. Unsurprisingly, these plans have gone unanswered by either side. If Putin announced plans to use nuclear weapons, however, China might become alarmed at the prospect of a more direct and comprehensive response from other nuclear powers, most of which are in NATO. If Russia escalates the conflict by using nuclear weapons, the US might immediately become involved in the conflict, regardless of who sits in the White House at the moment. This could end up dragging China into a war that it might not be able to win, even if the war is conventional rather than nuclear in nature. So China's best course of action might be to pacify Russia into not making any additional rash moves, which were already made when Putin enlisted Kim Jong-un's military to fight his battles. Similarly, NATO's best move might be to reinforce Ukraine to demonstrate that the alliance would fully stand to defend the country in the event of a nuclear attack. So far, Putin's actions have revolved around threats and offenses that he could get away with due to support from China and NATO's internal struggles to maintain the status quo. A nuclear attack ostensibly presents a threat to both of these parties. It might be in NATO's best interest to make Ukraine as unpalatable of a nuclear target as possible. But what do you think? How likely is Putin to actually use nuclear weapons in Ukraine? Russians are turning against Putin. His so-called special military operation has become a humiliating mess. What was supposed to last 2 weeks has dragged on for over 2 years, with Putin failing at every turn. Now it's not just NATO-backed Ukraine he's struggling against. His own people are refusing to fight his wars. Let's break down how Putin's incompetence is driving his soldiers and citizens to revolt. We'll start with the most common major event that's possibly turned the tide of the entire war: Ukraine's invasion of Kursk. This is a significant shift in the war's tenuous dynamic between the two sides. For 30 months, Russia was the obvious aggressor, pushing further and deeper into Ukraine. Ukrainians were spread thin, trying to defend their lands and push the Russians back. While the first wave of attacks, the ones that managed to nearly make it into the Ukrainian capital of Kyiv, were ultimately repelled by the end of 2022, that didn't stop Putin from maintaining his war rhetoric and strategy. Before the Kursk invasion, Putin's goals were simple: take as much of Ukraine as possible. and as fast as possible, and by any means necessary. And the rhetoric spouted by the Kremlin's news reports worked in Putin's favor. The citizens were assured that the Ukrainians were to blame for all the minute reasons behind the special military operation, and that the Russian army would soon quell them and return Russia to peace. Of course, those reports only worked because of how Russia carefully managed to spin the narrative. Kremlin divided the Russian people into two groups: urbanites who lived in Moscow and other major cities far away from war and with nothing to fear, and the rural population, who was at the Kremlin's beck and call with multiple rounds of conscriptions and lucrative enlistment contracts, but we'll get around to those later. What the Kursk invasion changed is that Russia suddenly became the defender. Ukraine stepped over the boundary that divided the two countries and invaded one of Russia's regions, one that turned out to be woefully defended by Russian forces. The entire invasion seemed more like a fever dream than an actual military campaign. When it started, the Ukrainian government and its army was silent. There were no news reports to determine whether the invasion was successful and what exactly the goal of that strategy was in the first place. The first reports came from the Kremlin. They touted that the Ukrainian army crossed the border with a paltry 100 troops and a few military vehicles in what they thought was a desperate attempt to divert Russian forces from the real front, the ongoing fighting in the Ukrainian Donetsk region. The Russian authorities claimed that they would push back the Ukrainian invaders quickly and that the Russian forces stationed in Kursk were more than capable of doing so. A few days later, the reports from Russia became more dubious. The invasion seemed to not only have continued but progressed. Before long, Ukraine managed to take over control of dozens of villages and towns in the Kursk region. So what happened to elicit this change? The answer is rather simple: conscripts. Rather than using professional, contractually obligated soldiers to man the defensive positions in Kursk, the military was using fresh conscripts to fill those spots. The same was probably true for many other regions neighboring Ukraine, but Kursk was just the one where the effects were obvious. The conscripts in Kursk turned out to be no match for the invading Ukrainian forces, which over the first week of the invasion grew in number and obtained more artillery support. Over the few weeks of news coverage concerning the events in Kursk, there were more than a few videos showing Russian soldiers simply surrendering to the advancing Ukrainians. According to the report issued by the Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrsky, the Ukrainian army captured close to 600 Russian soldiers, who then became prisoners of war and were transported to Ukrainian prisons. In an early report from one of the prisons responsible for housing the POWs, it was suggested that roughly 80% of the soldiers in Kursk were conscripts. But why is that so terrible for the Russian army? Well, to answer that, we need to delve a bit deeper into how the Russian army functions, or more precisely, how Russia gets more soldiers. Unlike the US and many other countries around the world where enlisting in military service is entirely voluntary, the Russian army has a two-pronged enlistment process. First, there are contract soldiers, known as kontraktniki, who sign a 3-year contract in the Russian army, but then are generally encouraged to sign multiple, consecutive contracts to prolong their service. The second method is conscription. Before the Russo-Ukrainian War, every Russian male between 18 and 27 years of age was required to register with the Russian military. Out of that group, a specific number of registrants would be called to join the military every 6 months to serve as conscripts for 1 year. Originally, the mandatory military service period was 2 years, but was subsequently reduced, but we'll go over the reasoning for that a bit later. While Russia maintained a generally small population of conscripts, given that they were constantly replaced with fresh recruits, the war in Ukraine changed that significantly. Over the course of the war, it's estimated that the Russian military has been conscripting at a rate of roughly 130,000 soldiers every 6 months. In July 2023, the upper age limit for the draft was raised from 27 to 30, allowing Russia to pull from an even larger pool of Russian men to conscript into the army. As a result, Russia has been relying more and more on its stock of conscripts, rather than using contract soldiers. But where's the difference, you might ask? First, contract soldiers are paid for being in the military, and quite handsomely so. During the war, the Russian government has dangled contracts that pay out as much as 3 or 4 times the average salary. This has been particularly noticeable in the more rural regions of the country, which has resulted in the significantly lopsided demographics of the Russian military as of late. According to some sources, a Muscovite is over 50 times less likely to die in the war than a person belonging to a minority from Siberia. This trend shows that Russia is counting on people being desperate to earn a living wage and willing to sign up for 2 years of service in the military. Regardless, that doesn't quite solve the problem with conscription, since mandatory military service this way is largely unpaid. No, the major difference between contract soldiers and conscripts is in how they're treated in the army and the general structure of the Russian military. You see, unlike the US, which has 5 basic training locations for all recruits, the Russian military training is much more decentralized. Recruits are immediately assigned units, and each unit is responsible for conducting training according to the agreed-upon standards. However, this decentralization has led to many officers skirting the training regimes they enforce, creating a large variance in experience and training between each unit. Furthermore, since the conscripts are only meant to serve for 1 year, they typically don't receive the same amount or quality of training that the contract soldiers do. Usually, conscripts don't partake in many battle simulations, and their roles in the military are largely supportive, such as cleaning, cooking, or driving. If they're attached to squads, they typically have administrative or perfunctory roles, such as ceremonies or tending to military equipment. That's led to a somewhat disparaging view of conscripts throughout the Russian military, making them seem like the army's last resort and the bottom rung of the military. This is compounded by the fact that the Russian military legally can't deploy conscripts on missions abroad. Even if they were meant to be combat ready, their role in the army is to defend Russia against foreign attacks rather than lead the charge. What all this meant is that even at the height of the Russo-Ukrainian War, there was somewhat of an understanding that conscripts wouldn't be anywhere near the front lines, which is currently deep inside Ukrainian territory. But that all changed with the Kursk invasion. Suddenly, Ukraine became the attacker on Russian soil, and the conscripts were thrust into the heat of battle, as unprepared and under-equipped as they ever were. With all the previous points in mind, it's quite clear to see exactly why there has been a wave of surrenders in Kursk, and why the Russian military has failed to mount a significant defense in the region. With the floodgates to Russian territory open, Putin now has all the means and motive to actually send conscripts to defend Russia, and that's a particularly dangerous precedent, considering what happened to conscripts in previous campaigns. For that, we'll need to go back further into history, when the Soviet Union still existed. During Soviet times, the Russian army had several million conscripted soldiers, making it one of the largest conscripted armies in the world. Unlike today, these conscripts could be readily mobilized for any conflict. They ended up being deployed to fight in Afghanistan between 1979 and 1989. Known as the Soviet Union's Vietnam, the war ended up being one of the final nails in the coffin for the Soviet Union, but not without significant casualties. By the time the Soviet Union pulled out of Afghanistan, it was estimated to have lost 15,000 soldiers. While this number is insignificant compared to the casualties in the current war, the deaths of these mostly conscripted soldiers led to stern discontent with the Soviet regime and public institutions. The soldiers who survived the war were quickly forgotten amid the sweeping changes brought on by the fall of the Soviet Union, and sought to extend their military careers elsewhere. When Putin came to power, the Afghan veterans were brought back into the fold and awarded for their bravery and contribution to the country. Those same veterans became fervent supporters of Putin's regime, and perhaps a part of the reason the military was so ready to conduct offensive operations abroad. But for the average conscript, life would only get worse. After the war in Afghanistan came the first Chechen War in the mid-90s, leading to yet another estimated 10,000 deaths on the Russian side. As Russia considered Chechnya a Soviet republic and one close to reuniting with the Federation, it sent conscripts to fight in what would be a bloody civil war that led to as many as 100,000 civilian deaths, with 500,000 people displaced from the country. The protests against the regime began anew, and the public opinion on sending conscripts to war reached its lowest point. It was the war in Chechnya that ultimately caused the Russian Federation to sign the law preventing the deployment of conscripts abroad, yet the country still retained the draft. As a result, while Russia technically had compulsory military service, many families were trying their best to have young men avoid it as much as possible. Illnesses were invented and corroborated, and men were sent to higher education institutions. One of the ways to avoid the service was to be an active student. As Ian Garner, a historian focusing on Russian war history, explains, draft dodging is practically an art form in Russia. When the war between Russia and Ukraine escalated from a blitzkrieg to an attrition-based conflict, and Putin announced the first round of conscriptions, many Russians redoubled their efforts to avoid being called into service. As many as 900,000 people left the country by the end of 2022. Not all of them were service-capable men, but those men took their entire families and lives with them to get away from the Russian military. And now, with Ukraine in Russia's territory, the conscripts can again be called upon to the front lines, this time against an army that's much more experienced and determined to win. So it's no wonder that the scattered soldiers inside Kursk have been rapidly surrendering to incoming Ukrainians. They didn't really stand a chance. And if Ukraine decides to push its advantage, The same thing can happen to other nearby regions, spreading discontent among both the soldiers and the civilian population about Putin's actions in the war. The Kursk incursion also showed that Putin doesn't mind if hundreds of people need to be displaced from their homes. As current estimates suggest, there were roughly 200,000 people in the Ukraine-occupied regions of Kursk. Throughout all that, Russia is still giving far more attention to contract soldiers. While conscripts can technically sign a contract, they can only do so after their first year of military service. Considering the scale of the Russo-Ukrainian war, this means that a lot of the conscripts might not even get to see the end of their first year of service. All the promises of glory, heroism, and monetary compensation are firmly directed toward the contract soldiers, who are on the front lines, fighting to gain a mile of land in Donetsk while being pelted by NATO-supplied ammunition. When the conscripts captured in Kursk were interviewed, most suggested they didn't expect to see actual combat. They were given minimal training and equipment in order to stand their ground. Some military bloggers even suggested that the newest batches have undergone only a week of military training. This is not nearly enough to prepare a person to function in the military, let alone be on the battlefield. According to Russian policies, conscripts should be trained for 1 to 2 months and then get an additional 3 to 6 months of training to be considered ready to serve. In the US, the initial boot camp lasts 10 weeks and is followed by at least 22 weeks of advanced training. Compared to that, a week or two is practically nothing. The Kremlin is aware of the discrepancy in how it treats conscripts and contract NUKES, and has so far worked to get ahead of any damning reports to cover them up. While the Ukrainians were sweeping through the farmlands of Kursk with Russian conscripts surrendering in their wake, the officers were celebrating the official Officers' Day. The reports from the Kursk region still show a lack of proper military response from Russia. Zelensky has noted that Ukraine intends to keep the region occupied for as long as possible, giving it another chip to put on the negotiating table. In the meantime, Putin has been trying, and failing, to sweep the very existence of the Kursk invasion under the rug. But conscripts are not the only group Putin needs to be worried about. Some people much closer to Moscow, who can pull significant strings, have also started to doubt the Russian president's capability to lead the country. We're talking about the Russian oligarchs. These men and women, but mostly men, mainly got rich by Russia's prodigious expanse in the energy sector, particularly the oil and gas industries. The old oligarchs got their wealth in the 90s, when the government reforms caused significant industry changes, allowing the few to get rich off the switch from socialism to capitalism in what would be modern Russia. Putin largely tried to replace the old oligarchs, who criticized him when he came to power, albeit not as successfully. After a few were imprisoned, the remainder struck a deal with Putin to lose a part of their wealth and power, but remain in the Russian president's good graces and continue to benefit. But this only worked so long as the country's energy sector kept prospering. The Kremlin needed the oligarchs, who have developed extensive ties with prominent Western companies, as much as the oligarchs needed Putin, who could bail out failing companies via the state bank. The war in Ukraine turned the situation on its head. Practically overnight, Russia had lost some of its largest trading partners and had to scramble to sign trade deals with China and India to make up for the losses. The deals with China were arguably much less lucrative than those with Europe, but they were practically the only way to keep the country running during wartime. During 2023, the trade with China reached its peak at $240 billion and is now showing a slight decline. At the beginning of the war, when it was still uncertain how long it would take, the oligarchs remained silent on the matter, still looking to see the economic implications of the invasion. But when the first signs of trouble started, some chose to make a more public stance against the war. One such oligarch is Oleg Tinkov, who renounced his Russian citizenship in 2022 and called the Russian supporters morons. Tinkov is likely the first in many dominoes to crumble around Putin. Other oligarchs merely resorted to token criticism and grumbling, such as Mikhail Fridman, who co-founded Russia's largest private bank. Fridman returned to Russia when the conflict between Israel and Hamas broke out, showing that Putin still holds some reins in how oligarchs can operate. Putin has used the war as an opportunity to further curb the influence the oligarchs have on his regime. One example is the recent lawsuit to nationalize a company owned by one of Russia's richest men, Andrei Melnichenko. With Russia under extensive sanctions from the West, many companies owned by oligarchs such as Melnichenko no longer have the same economic connections they had before the war. It makes them surprisingly easy pickings for the Russian state to control them and people who own them as a result. But the oligarchs are probably in on the scheme as well. Remember when we discussed that many of them got rich in the energy sector? Well, that sector is not looking so good right now. Repeated Ukrainian strikes on key refineries have caused widespread deficits in refined oil and gas. This is primarily due to Russia using the just-in-time delivery approach, keeping very little oil in reserve, despite being one of the world's largest producers of it. This means that a sudden drop in production, such as a refinery in Western Russia being bombed to oblivion, can disrupt the flow of these precious resources. This affects both trade and the internal economy. In fact, Russia has lost nearly 15% of its oil refining capacity over the previous year, which has ultimately caused the government to stop exporting fuel to all but 4 former Soviet countries until the end of 2024, with some analysts suggesting that the ban will persist through 2025. Additionally, Russia has asked Kazakhstan to create a reserve of 100,000 tons of gasoline that can be supplied to Russia on short notice. Of course, that doesn't mean that the Russian oligarchs have really lost much throughout the war. Bloomberg published a list of a dozen companies that collectively gained more than $11 billion in 2023 alone through dividend payments, so the money still kept flowing into the oligarchs' pockets, even if there was a little bit less of it from other sources. However, Putin's attempts to dismantle some of the biggest earners and the fact that the oil and gas trade are starting to directly get hit by Ukrainian attacks create a dangerous precedent for the oligarchs who operate in the sector. As the energy sector is responsible for roughly 20% of the country's GDP, consistent trade deal cancellations and export bans are bound to create long-term deficits. Western sanctions also limit how much coverage the oligarchs have under Putin. With the connections they fostered severed by sanctions, Putin may find the old stock of oligarchs useless in maintaining the facade of universal support in the country. To make matters worse for Putin, Ukraine has started to ramp up its offensive, which can further alienate oligarchs and the middle class alike. On September 10, 2024, Ukraine launched its biggest and most ambitious drone strike yet. Over 140 drones were deployed to strike deep into Russian territory. The attack is the second of its kind, following the earlier August 21st strike, with 45 drones. The main target, Moscow itself. While the initial strike in August was fully intercepted by Russian anti-air defenses, the September strike killed at least one person and wrecked dozens of homes in the urban center of Russia. The ensuing chaos diverted 50 flights coming into Moscow. This is the first instance of Ukraine hitting the Russian capital and is likely a portent of attacks to come. With these drone strikes, Ukraine has sent a clear message to Putin: Russia is no longer safe. The attacks can resonate deeply within the Moscow communities, which have so far been largely unaffected by the war itself. When combined with Ukraine managing to get hold of more Russian territory in a month than Russia's offensive has done over the previous 7, the attack set a dangerous precedent for Putin. The Kremlin might no longer be able to sweep the truth about the war under the rug. And if the conscription issues continue, Russia may need to tap into a resource it hasn't used in a while: the middle and upper classes of large cities. Somewhat surprisingly, this presents yet another attack on Russian oligarchs. While they could stand to watch the action unfold from the sidelines and rake in the money, the wealthy Russians are now truly in a pinch. Their companies are under threat of being seized by the government, their cash flows are being squeezed by the export bans, and their children might be called upon to die for Putin's fragile ego. Even the newer wave of Russia's elite is starting to feel the pain. Since the energy sector has been booming for a while, it's caused a chain reaction of other sectors falling behind. China has swept in to take the reins and create near monopolies for consumer goods ranging from smartphones to cars to agricultural equipment. With domestic manufacturing under attack, there's little reason to stay in business if it's cheaper to buy from abroad. As such, Putin is on a collision course with the very same people who have supported his stranglehold on Russian politics. If he decides to make an overtly aggressive move, the oligarchs might become desperate enough to remove him from the seat permanently. Ultimately, Putin is on the verge of losing support from practically all of Russia's citizens, at least the ones who can directly impact the war in Ukraine. If one of those dominoes starts falling, Putin will likely have to double down on the war in Ukraine to close it out before it's too late. On paper, Russia still has the resources to outlast Ukraine in a war of attrition. After all, despite accruing nearly 700,000 troop casualties over the past 30 months, Ukraine has lost nearly 500,000 soldiers itself, and Russia has twice the population to throw at the meat grinder. However, Ukraine's moving into Russian territory has renewed Western support, with the US announcing more aid packages before the end of the year. Additionally, despite long-standing saber-rattling, Russia's threats of deploying nuclear weapons against NATO have turned out to be empty so far. The alliance can be emboldened to send more advanced military equipment to Ukraine, some of which were blocked by the very same nuclear threats. The first batch of 65 F-16 fighter jets has already taken flight in the skies above Ukraine, and Zelensky now might have just enough leverage to ask for more. If Putin doesn't end the war soon, someone else will end the war for him, and it's unlikely to be in his favor. But what do you think? How long will the war continue, and will Putin remain Russia's president afterward? No matter how the war in Ukraine ends, one thing is for sure: Putin will come out of it battered and broken. Reports from August 5, 2024 state the country has lost 579,490 troops in Ukraine since the beginning of its full-scale invasion. Tens of thousands of vehicles, weapons, and resources have also been sacrificed. Russia's economy has been damaged beyond repair, and most importantly, the carefully constructed image of a resurgent superpower has irrevocably shattered, exposing Russia as a shell of its former self. Given these catastrophic and enduring consequences, it's only natural to wonder, would Russia's President Vladimir Putin have pulled the trigger on that fateful February 24th had he known what was in store for his country? The simple answer is probably no. But these consequences are so deeply humiliating that they practically beg another question. What was Putin thinking in the first place? Again, the answer is simple. He thought he would win, and do so with ease at that. But how could he possibly have been so wrong? This time the answer isn't as straightforward. However, it does revolve around a single thing: unfounded trust. Trust in his institutions, trust in his generals, and trust in himself and his misguided ambitions. Those are the three big mistakes Putin made. He trusted all the wrong people. This is the story of how that misplaced trust led Putin to make one miscalculation after another, leaving Russia in ruins forever. Now, before you start feeling too bad for Putin and his blind trust, you should know that he's fully to blame for each and every mistake and miscalculation made in Ukraine. In other words, Putin himself set the stage for his own downfall. His strategic blunders were not mere accidents, they were the inevitable outcome of a deeply flawed approach to governance. To understand the underlying reasons for Putin's three primary mistakes in Ukraine, we must travel back in time, back to the earliest days of Putin's rise to power. Even before becoming president of Russia, Putin made one thing clear: he valued loyalty above all else. In the 1990s, he served as the deputy mayor of St. Petersburg under Anatoly Sobchak, his mentor and former professor. When Sobchak lost his re-election bid by a margin of 1.2% in 1996 to Putin's fellow deputy mayor Vladimir Yakovlev, Putin didn't accept a position in the new city administration. His decision to quit was fueled by one thing alone: his loyalty to Sobchak. Supposedly, when he turned down the gig in Yakovlev's office, he did so with his now infamous quote, "It's better to be hanged for loyalty than be rewarded for betrayal." Though praiseworthy on the surface, this unwavering commitment to loyalty set a precedent for his future leadership style, often valuing blind allegiance over competence and merit. So since the very moment he became president in 2000, Putin gradually started to amass power and ensure it stays unchallenged. First, he found a way to remain in power even after officially ceasing to be the president. After serving his second term from 2004 to 2008, Putin engineered a political environment where he could serve as prime minister while Dmitry Medvedev took on the presidency. However, Putin effectively maintained control behind the scenes. He used that control to do what he's always done: discreetly eliminate any institutions that might pose a challenge to his authority. He made sure the media was pro-Putin or off the air. He suppressed dissent and controlled the narrative. As years passed, it became abundantly clear autocratic rule was making a comeback. But this wasn't the only comeback in Russia. The arrival of 2012 saw Putin back in office. After all, the Russian constitution only said that one and the same person may not be elected president of the Russian Federation for more than 2 terms running. It didn't say anything about more than 2 non-consecutive terms. And so, thanks to Article 81, Section 3 of the Russian constitution and some underhanded political maneuvering, Putin returned to power. Well, at least officially. Unofficially, he never left. To make sure he could officially stay in power for years to come, he made, or influenced, a few constitutional reforms. First, the presidential term was increased from 4 to 6 years in 2008, allowing Putin to serve his third term from 2012 to 2018. Then his previous terms were magically erased in 2020, allowing him to run once again for president in 2024, even after serving 2 sets of 2 consecutive terms. It was a mockery of democratic principles. But there's no room for democracy in Putin's regime, only a ruthless consolidation of power and a calculated disregard for the rule of law. Given the political environment Putin built, it shouldn't be surprising that he's had nothing but sycophants and yes-men around him. After all, he has a track record of treating anyone who disagrees with him as an enemy. And we all know the eventual fate of his enemies. They suffer mysterious heart attacks, they fall from windows, their aeroplane or helicopter crashes, or they're simply shot dead in broad daylight. As a result of this brutal method of silencing dissent, only those willing to flatter Putin and follow him without question can remain in his inner circle. Simply put, Putin has created his own little echo chamber and has never truly received a reality check. This is what reinforces his delusions and leads him to believe he's always right. And this is what's caused his servicemen to feed him inaccurate information that has eventually led to disastrous miscalculations in Ukraine. Just look at it this way. If your life is on the line, you'll tell the dictator what he wants to hear, not what he needs to hear. Worst of all, this approach doesn't involve carefully collecting intelligence and then weighing what to share and what to withhold. No, it involves playing a guessing game of what the dictator wants to hear. After all, if truth has proven time and again to hold little weight in Russia, why bother seeking it in the first place? Why waste time? Essentially, Putin's approach to governance has stripped his advisors of any incentive to put in the hours and actually come up with sound advice for him. Had his advisors done so in the months before February 24, 2022, the devastating war probably wouldn't still be raging in Ukraine. But Putin's first mistake isn't setting up a system where truth is irrelevant or even detrimental. It's what all autocrats do. His first mistake was trusting the advice from the very institutions he had corrupted and controlled. To be more specific, Putin's first major mistake was trusting Russia's Federal Security Service, or FSB for short. The FSB is Russia's primary security agency and the main successor to the Soviet Union's infamous KGB, in which Putin once proudly served as a lieutenant colonel. This agency, eager to please and protect its position within Putin's regime, fed him optimistic and overly favorable reports about the situation in Ukraine. The FSB had two primary tasks: to gauge the West's potential response to another invasion and determine how the Ukrainian population, military, and government would react to a Russian offensive. In both tasks, they failed spectacularly. As far as the West goes, their mistaken assumption was that it would remain divided and passive, fearing economic repercussions. To the FSB's credit, that's precisely what the West did every time Putin previously flexed his muscles. In Georgia, in Crimea, in Syria, the West's response was tepid at best. When he gathered an army of 70,000 or so to invade Georgia in 2008, all he received was a financial slap on the wrist. When he illegally annexed Crimea in 2014, the West's reaction was mainly focused on sanctions that barely scratched Russia's economy. Sure, the United Nations General Assembly also passed Resolution 58262, with 100 countries in favor of protecting Ukraine's territorial integrity, but that's about it. A matching resolution wasn't even adopted by the UN Security Council, as Russia has veto power there. And when he propped up the murderous regime of Bashar al-Assad in Syria, the West could only muster vague condemnations and half-hearted measures. Basically, no punishment of consequence came for Putin when he had Sergei Skripal, a former Russian military intelligence officer, poisoned in the UK, or when the Russian hackers intervened in the 2016 US presidential election. In fact, Putin was only getting bolder, while the response from the West was only getting weaker. Germany was even at one point considering starting fresh with Russia, to the point where Angela Merkel, who served as Chancellor of Germany from 2005 to 2021, publicly questioned some of the US sanctions. Of course, there was no tale of friendship and forgiveness behind this skepticism, just a need for Russian gas, which made up 55% of all gas consumed in Germany before the invasion of Ukraine. So the FSB and Putin saw the West as weak and fickle, driven by economic self-interest rather than principled resistance. As such, the Western countries would never seek punitive sanctions that could harm their own economies too. They believed the West wouldn't be able to agree on a simple point, whether Ukraine was worth the fight or not. And in the chaos of indecision and fragmentation, Russia could just swoop in and take Kyiv in a matter of days. But where the FSB operatives failed miserably was recognizing that the West was actually starting to harden its attitude towards Russia. After years of Putin flouting the rule of law boldly and almost proudly, the Western policymakers started coming to terms with a grim reality. Putin was never going to stop. So succumbing to Russia's blackmail and intimidation was slowly ceasing to be an option for the West. In other words, there was never any doubt about how the West would respond to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The Western countries weren't debating whether or not to get involved. They were debating whether Putin was truly foolish enough to go through with such a brazen move. But when he did, he was met with a united Western front. Russia was slapped with unprecedented economic sanctions. Hundreds of Western businesses withdrew from Russia. Millions of the country's assets were frozen. Even new German Chancellor Olaf Scholz froze the Nord Stream 2 pipeline project and sought a new gas supplier elsewhere. Though it took a while, Western countries eventually started delivering financial, humanitarian, and military aid to Ukraine. As of February 29, 2024, the US, Germany, and the UK have donated the most as individual nations. The US donated $2.53 billion in humanitarian aid, $21.47 billion in financial aid, and $43.08 billion in military aid. And that was before the $61 billion aid package was passed in April 2024. As for Germany, it sent Ukraine more than $37.24 billion in financial aid, making available much more than just military equipment, and that's not to mention all the aid it indirectly secured for Ukraine by tirelessly campaigning for other Western allies to step up. Finally, the UK has donated $16.3 billion in financial aid, of which $9.91 billion is for military assistance. That's pretty far from leaving Ukraine to its own devices, isn't it? But let's be honest, even if Ukraine was left to fend for itself, its people and soldiers would have fought Russia to the bitter end. This brings us to the second fatally wrong assessment of the FSB. The agency believed that the Russian army would meet little to no resistance in Ukraine. Even worse, there were strong beliefs that the Russian soldiers would be welcomed as liberators, not invaders. With this in mind, it shouldn't be surprising that Putin expected to seize Kyiv in a matter of days. Again, these assumptions are somewhat founded on past experiences. After all, Russia annexed Crimea without spilling any blood. It didn't even send in 190,000 troops as it did for the Ukraine invasion, just about 6 helicopters and 3 Ilyushin Il-76 airlifters worth of the so-called Little Green Men, i.e. members of Russian Spetsnaz special forces units with no military insignia. But if the FSB had actually done its job, it would have realized that Ukraine in 2022 was not Crimea in 2014. We aren't talking about a peninsula filled with apathetic or pro-Russian sentiments. We're talking about an independent nation with its own identity, culture, and independence, no matter how hard Russia tried to deny these. Just because some Ukrainians shared Russia's antagonism toward the West didn't make them pro-Russian. The same goes for expressing nostalgia for the Soviet era. According to a poll conducted in April 2014 by the Kyiv International Institute for Sociology, as many as 70% of Ukrainians from the southeastern provinces targeted by Russia were against a unification with Russia. So no, Ukraine didn't welcome the Russian troops with open arms and flowers. It welcomed them with bullets, with fierce resistance, unwavering patriotism, and a determined fight for its sovereignty, a fight that the Russian invaders were utterly unprepared for. Besides misjudging the Ukrainian people and underestimating their resistance, the FSB also underestimated Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky. If it was up to Zelensky's predecessors Petro Poroshenko and Viktor Yanukovych, Putin might have just been able to walk in and seize Kyiv. But Zelensky, who the FSB pegged as a weak link and saw as an actor, not a politician, proved to be anything but a pushover. While Zelensky might not be perfect, he certainly rose to the occasion. This democratically elected leader didn't flee the country as the FSB believed he would. Instead, he stayed in Kyiv, often sharing messages of defiance and unity, rallying the Ukrainian people and fortifying their resolve. "We are here, we are in Kyiv, we are defending Ukraine," was one of these messages, a sentiment that the FSB never saw coming. But remember, Putin was the one to set this catastrophic misjudgment in motion. He has made the FSB what it is today, a toxic echo chamber of incompetence. So he got exactly the FSB he deserved and the intelligence he deserved, flawed, delusional, and disastrously misleading. The same goes for the information he received from his high-ranking military officials. This brings us to Putin's second major mistake, trusting his generals, who were no less adept at feeding him false assurances and wishful thinking. From the military perspective, Putin was assured that the invasion of Ukraine would be a walk in the park. After all, that's how the potential war in Ukraine looked on paper. In one corner you had the mighty Russian military, believed to be the second strongest in the world, a vast force equipped with modern weaponry, overwhelming numbers, and a reputation for brute strength. In the other corner there was Ukraine, a country with a significantly smaller and less well-equipped military, plagued by outdated technology and years of underfunding. Just a comparison of the numbers alone should show why Russia looked a clear winner on paper. In 2021, Ukraine spent $4.7 billion on defense. Russia, on the other hand, spent almost tenfold, $45.8 billion. Ukraine had about 196,000 active duty troops and 900,000 reservists. Russia also had 900,000 soldiers, but they were the active duty ones, while their reserves boasted a staggering 2 million people. When marching into Ukraine, Russia sent about 190,000 troops, almost as many as Ukraine had in total. The situation wasn't any different in the equipment department. Ukraine had 3,309 armored fighting vehicles. Russia had 15,857. Ukraine operated 132 aircraft, Russia with 1,391. Ukraine had no submarines, and Russia owned 49. But as the battle for Ukraine began, it became clear that Putin's generals made two blunders. They overestimated the Russian forces and underestimated the Ukrainian ones. For starters, Ukraine wasn't the only battle Russia was fighting or having a standoff with at the time. There were also the Baltic states, Finland, the US, and NATO in general. So it wasn't like the country could deploy all its available troops and equipment to Ukraine. In contrast, Ukraine's sole focus was Russia, so it came at it in full force. Tens of thousands of Ukrainians of all ages mobilized almost instantly, queuing for hours to join their local defense units. As it turned out, the army that Russia saw as weak and disorganized was actually a collection of heroes ready to defend their homeland with unprecedented unity. Fleeing or surrendering was never an option, and yet that's precisely what Putin was told the Ukrainian soldiers would do in a matter of days, if not hours. But the problem wasn't just that the Ukrainian military turned out to be much stronger than anticipated. It was also that the Russian military turned out to be a far cry from the supposed second strongest military in the world. Faced with unexpected resistance and plagued by internal issues, the Russian military lost at least half its professional army in the first 6 months of the war in Ukraine. These numbers included some of the most elite soldiers and officers, as well as advanced weaponry and equipment. It seems that years of relentless propaganda, extravagant military parades, and rosy forecasts from his generals misled Putin into believing his nation had a world-class military capable of engaging and prevailing in any continental conflict. The actual performance of the Russian military on the Ukrainian battlefield painted an entirely different picture. As the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken put it, "The Kremlin often claimed it had the second strongest military in the world, and many believed it. Today, many see Russia's military as the second strongest in Ukraine." Again, to be fair, these realizations came later, even for the most seasoned Western intelligence officers. Although US intelligence correctly estimated that the invasion was going to happen, it initially underestimated the scale of the Ukrainian resistance and the Russian military's inefficiencies. Simply put, US intelligence also believed that Kyiv would collapse swiftly. But the US intelligence officers were mistaken, as was Putin and his collection of sycophants. But even if we take Putin's lapdogs out of the equation, chances are the Russian president would still repeat many of the same mistakes. Why? Because he would let himself be blinded by his misguided beliefs and unfounded ambition. And that was Putin's third major mistake, his overconfidence in his infallibility and his catastrophic overreach. But let's pump the brakes for a second. Putin hasn't gotten where he is by making purely reckless decisions and moves. Before the invasion of Ukraine, he was perceived as a calculating and shrewd strategist, adept at leveraging power and exploiting weaknesses. So what led him down such a disastrous path this time? The answer to this question is multifaceted. First of all, it appears that Putin truly believed that Ukraine was Russian territory, and Ukrainians and Russians were one people, forcefully separated by the fall of the Soviet Union. He saw the separation between Russia and Ukraine as a historical injustice, and he was hell-bent on correcting this injustice at all costs. Worst of all, he has seemingly stuck to his conviction, as even after almost 2 years of conflict, he argued that Russia held a historic claim to Ukraine in his February 2024 interview with the former Fox News host Tucker Carlson. He also believed in his heart of hearts that the West was the true architect of this supposed division. To justify his actions, Putin propagated the idea that NATO's alleged expansion into Eastern Europe was the catalyst for his aggressive stance, blaming the West for forcing his hand and exacerbating the situation. In his eyes, he had no other option but to invade Ukraine or launch a special military operation as he saw it. Otherwise, Ukraine would have applied for NATO membership, as encouraged by the US, and the rest of Russia's European neighbors were likely to follow suit. Since he saw NATO's expansion as an existential threat to Russia, he had to act to ensure the survival and security of the Russian state and people and prevent a strategic encirclement. Paradoxically, it's precisely Putin's actions that ended up pushing Finland and Sweden, traditionally neutral countries, to join NATO on April 4, 2023 and March 7, 2024 respectively. So in trying to secure Russia's sphere of influence, Putin's invasion of Ukraine only accelerated the very outcomes he sought to avoid. Of course, many Western commentators see pointing the finger at NATO expansion as nothing but an excuse for his atrocious actions. In reality, Putin was fueled by a desire to restore Russia's superpower status and secure his legacy. That's the relentless ambition that blinded him to the realities staring him right in the face. To achieve these goals, Putin was seemingly ready to fight the entire West, not just Ukraine. He wanted to be revered in history books as the man who succeeded in restoring Russia's grandeur, defying Western dominance, and rewriting the global order. As Professor Brian Taylor, a Russian politics expert, put it, Putin saw himself as a great historic Russian leader restoring Russian lands. Throw his overwhelming public support and lack of blowback into the mix, and it becomes clear why Putin was so audacious. He was intoxicated by the belief that he was on the verge of a historic triumph. And let's remember, Russian success in Ukraine seemed more than plausible to everyone, not just Putin, so he wasn't entirely off base. He also seemed to believe that the timing for the invasion was just right. Zelensky's approval rating might have soared after the Russian invasion, but in 2021 it hit a record low. Only 12% of Ukrainians strongly approved of Zelensky's actions, which led Putin to believe the Ukrainian elite would likely unite against their president. In the same year, the Biden administration decided to withdraw the US troops from Afghanistan, an event that severely impacted global perceptions of American resolve and stability. Germany and the UK also got new leaders, as Olaf Scholz succeeded Angela Merkel as Chancellor of Germany, and Liz Truss briefly replaced Boris Johnson as Prime Minister of the UK back in September 2022. Meanwhile, French President Emmanuel Macron was under a lot of pressure due to domestic issues and a highly contentious presidential election. In all this chaos, Putin saw his chance to strike and avoid facing a united Western front. But just like the FSB, he was wrong. Due to his isolation during the COVID-19 pandemic and his rumored illness, Putin wasn't able to verify most of his beliefs and the FSB's claims. He also failed to see how weak his military truly was. Before the pandemic, he would often oversee military exercises and visit various facilities. He would travel often, engaging directly with military leaders and receiving first-hand updates on operational readiness. But as the pandemic took hold, his mobility was restricted and his reliance on remote briefings and filtered reports grew. This isolation eroded his grasp on reality and convinced him that he was the savior that Russia had yearned for ever since the Soviet Union collapsed. With the rumors of his long-term and seemingly terminal illness, Putin might have wanted to secure his legacy before his time ran out. Based on all these misguided beliefs, he made his gravest mistake. He launched a terribly miscalculated war in Ukraine. All of Putin's three major mistakes created the perfect storm that managed to reshape the global order, but not in the way that Putin had anticipated. The very institutions, tactics, and beliefs that kept him in power for over 20 years were now his undoing. But what do you think? Which of Putin's mistakes was the gravest, and which misguided belief cost him the most?
If you're an affluent citizen in a mafia state, when would you think it's time to pack your mob boss off to a comfortable exile, preferably in the middle of nowhere? For Russia's oligarchs, the time to act against their Don might be coming soon. But why? When the war in Ukraine began, Western experts hoped that military defeat and pressure from economic sanctions would inspire action against Putin on the part of Russia's affluent elite. Russia might be a dictatorship, but even dictators need to keep their supporters happy. In the initial days after sanctions were put in place, such as on the SWIFT financial system, Russia's currency, the ruble, cratered, and the Russian economy shrank by about 1.2% in 2022. It rebounded in 2023 though, as Russia exploited new energy trading relationships with countries like China, India, and Turkey, which wanted to take advantage of bargain prices for Russian oil and gas. Growth in 2023 was about 3.6%. Russia also experienced 4.7% growth in the first 2 quarters of 2024. The ruble, meanwhile, rebounded from its low of a 142.6-to-1 exchange ratio with the US dollar on March 7, 2022. Although it never sustainably recovered to pre-war levels, it was generally trending toward them through 2024. Russia's economic growth and incremental gains on the battlefield were enough for Putin to be re-elected as the president of Russia earlier this year, with a totally legitimate 88% of the vote, conveniently the highest he had ever received in the 5 times he contested the office. At this point, it's best to remember that Putin's new best friend, Kim Jong-un of North Korea, holds ceremonial elections too. Russia's electoral ceremony came at the time when Ukraine's morale and foreign aid were at a low point and its ammunition shortages were at a high point. But things have changed significantly since then. The West has ramped up its military aid and loosened some of the restrictions on Ukraine's use of long-range weapons, such as the Storm Shadow and ATACMS missiles, against targets in Russian territory. There's more. Russian casualties ballooned during the summer as Ukraine's new weapons and ammunition made its meat grinder tactics even costlier. As the Russian military ground its way forward in eastern Ukraine, it suffered enormously. Ukraine inflicted 70,000 casualties between May and July, a rate of about 1,000 per day, and roughly a tenth of the total number of dead and wounded Russia had suffered throughout the entire war. Despite these casualties, Putin did not issue another mobilization order, even though he is in desperate need of more manpower. Why? Because he likely understands that it would be a bridge too far, even for him. Most of the soldiers on the front come from Russia's poorer, minority and outlying populations. However, these areas have already suffered heavy casualties and are under stress since many of the military-age men have already been drafted. An additional mobilization order would need to be broader in its scope. It would likely need to include men from Moscow and St. Petersburg, since they're Russia's largest cities. Russia's elites might be able to overlook the destruction of military-aged populations outside of their country's European heartland, but they are not willing to shoulder the costs of the war themselves. Putin understands this and has taken great care to avoid shifting the costs of the war onto the affluent populations of Moscow and St. Petersburg. That policy has forced him to be creative when it comes to getting manpower. Such methods have included the recruitment of foreign troops from Africa, coercing foreign students studying in Russia to sign up for military service, lest they face deportation or imprisonment, and even human trafficking, where Russian agents trick men from India and other Southern Asian countries into taking fake jobs that then require military service. Russia's elites were fine with all of this. But something changed in August. something which caused the ruble's value to start collapsing again, something which exposed them to the consequences of the war. On August 6th, Ukraine began its incursion into Russia's Kursk region. Poorly trained conscripts guarding the border areas were completely unprepared and surrendered. Fortifications that were supposed to have impeded the movement of hostile troops proved useless. The uselessness of fortifications supposedly similar to the ones that had successfully stopped Ukraine's offensive into Zaporizhia in 2023 likely came because the work was done improperly. This time around, corrupt Russian officers took the allocated money for themselves instead. The result was sloppy construction. In May 2023, a small force of pro-Ukrainian Russian fighters held territory in the border Belgorod region for several days before withdrawing. This Belgorod raid signaled the weakness of Russia's border defenses and caused significant chaos on the Russian home front. Despite this, Russia appears to have waved it off, believing it could never happen again. Ukraine took advantage of this belief and decided to launch a much bigger raid now. The offensive into Kursk and Belgorod regions has seen Ukraine occupy much more territory in Russia. Seizing territory in Russia has also given Ukraine's weapons longer reach. It may not be able to use Storm Shadows and ATACMS, but moving forward has given Ukraine's shorter-range weapons an ability to reach new targets. It also gives Ukraine territory from which to launch further drone attacks, sometimes at long ranges. Ukraine has now accumulated a lot of experience in launching drone attacks against important targets in Russia. A recent example occurred in June, when a drone attack damaged one of Russia's precious Su-57 fighter jets. Ukraine has also launched attacks on Moscow. Now that Ukraine occupies territory in Russia, those attacks are hitting higher-value targets. Long the victims of Russia's attacks on its civilian energy infrastructure, Ukraine gave Russia a taste of its own medicine on September 1, 2024. Ukrainian drones hit a power plant near Moscow on that night. Ukraine has also captured or targeted oil depots and refineries. These energy sources are not only important for Russian civilian life, they are the backbone of Russia's economy. Oil and gas accounted for 22.4% of Russian exports in 2021 and 30 to 50% of its federal budget over the past decade before the war. The damage to these facilities is a reason why the ruble tumbled following Ukraine's incursion. The attacks also came at a bad time for Russia. It's about to get cold there, and Putin will need to ensure the power stays on to heat homes. A harsh winter in Moscow because of Ukrainian attacks on Russia's energy infrastructure is a sure way to create more discontent at home. Putin may be willing to lose over 1 million men to achieve his objectives in Ukraine, but as we know by now, he is not willing to subject the residents of Moscow and St. Petersburg to the war's harsh effects, whether directly or indirectly. That's why exposing elite Muscovites to the cost of the war is one of Ukraine's goals. President Zelensky has requested clearance to use long-range missiles against military targets near the Russian capital as part of demonstration attacks. To make matters even better for Ukraine, the Russian territory it now holds can be used as a relatively secure base to launch these attacks. This area is relatively secure because Putin cannot easily bomb it. Doing so means attacking his own country's civilian population. He might not care about deliberately attacking civilians in other countries like Ukraine and Syria, but when his own power is threatened, it's not a move he's keen on making. Putin may have something else to worry about too. On July 28th, he attended a naval parade in St. Petersburg. Ukraine allegedly had the knowledge and means to assassinate him that day. And Zelensky mentioned last November that if the chance arose, his country's military had every right to take it. The Ukrainians would, however, need American weapons to do the job. Washington refused this, allegedly on a call from Russia's new defense minister, Andrei Belyusov, to the United States Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin. However, Ukraine also let this information leak, demonstrating that they had the ability to act against him. In response to the incursion of Russia, Putin has had to reshuffle troops from the occupied territories in eastern Ukraine. He has also moved air defense systems from areas near the front line toward Moscow and the Kremlin. Tellingly, he's also moved them to Sochi, where he conveniently has a vacation home. Russia might be suffering from its largest invasion since World War II, but at least he feels safe. To make matters worse still for Russia, the incursion into Kursk and Belgorod was done with Western tanks at the forefront. Far from discouraging their use in this way, the Western powers are confirming that they will continue to supply Ukraine with weapons even to conduct the offensive. Not using Western weapons against targets in Russia was one of the last remaining conditions that French President Emmanuel Macron called a taboo earlier this year. This taboo, too, might now be starting to break. The West has invested significant diplomatic, military, and financial resources into Ukraine. Abandoning it now that it moved into Russian territory would not be an easy move to make without losing a lot of face and emboldening other authoritarian powers like China, Iran, and North Korea. Ukraine's offensive into Russia is not only about humiliating Putin, but also a way to get its Western partners to loosen restrictions on the use of long-range weapons. So far, these requests have not been granted, and the idea to use long-range missiles against targets in the Moscow area remains a Ukrainian dream. However, now that Ukraine is conducting operations in Russia, these taboos might find a way of breaking their own accord, a fact it is undoubtedly aware of. The offensive into Russian territory has deteriorated Moscow's standing on the international stage too. Later in August, on the day before Ukraine's Independence Day, President Zelensky hosted Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. This was a very important meeting because in July, Modi decided to visit Moscow instead of Washington during the NATO summit, a move which drew sharp international criticism. Modi was even seen hugging Putin. However, the Ukrainian attack into Russia might have begun to change his calculations. In Ukraine, Modi expressed his desire to play a personal role in negotiating a peace deal. He told Zelensky that in Moscow a month earlier, he had said to Putin that the conflict could not be solved on the battlefield. At the end of the summit, Zelensky thanked Modi for supporting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Modi repeated a similar sentiment shortly thereafter. This was a significant development because in June, India took part in a multilateral peace summit in Switzerland. At that summit, India did not sign on to a joint communique that emphasized the right to territorial integrity of Ukraine and all other states. As August ended, Zelensky hoped to take advantage of the strengthened ties. He proposed a summit in India to take place before the American presidential election on November 5th. Thus far, India has been reluctant to engage Ukraine in a systematic way while excluding Russia, but a spokesman for Modi's government did not rule out the idea of another bilateral summit. Modi has continued to insist that he personally wants to play a constructive role in the peace process. The strengthening of Ukraine's relationship with India would be significantly to Russia's disadvantage. Indian purchases of Russian energy have been crucial in preventing the latter's economy and currency from collapsing. In July 2024, at least, India overtook China as the largest purchaser of Russian energy. This is not a relationship that Russia can afford to see deteriorate. It likely isn't a coincidence that the ruble tumbled as Modi expressed his support for the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Responding too aggressively against the Ukrainian incursion also risks another critical relationship for Russia: the strategic partnership with China. Putin's potential resort to nuclear weapons, which has scared some policymakers in the West from providing Ukraine all the equipment it wants, will be increasingly revealed to be a hollow threat the longer Ukrainian troops occupy territory in Russia. China has insisted that no nuclear weapons should ever be used in the conflict. Ukraine and the West have long been upset with China for its passive attitude in regards to the war, but this is the one consistent policy that it's maintained since the invasion began. Because Russia is dependent on Chinese energy purchases and parts for its military equipment, it cannot afford to alienate Beijing. Ukraine's continual demonstration that it can hold territory in Russia, gain more of it, and strike at Russia's two most precious population centers does more every day to erase the supposed red lines Putin drew. Ukraine knows it can do this because Russia cannot afford to issue nuclear threats too much and risk its relationship with China. The West may have underestimated Putin's ability to hold on to power. He held on early in the war, when Russia's economy appeared to be on the brink of collapse. He continued to hold on in the second half of 2022, when Russian forces had been driven from much of the territory it had taken earlier in the year. But in the face of these recent developments and signals of weakness, Russia's elite might be starting to question their loyalty to their dictator. The deceased Yevgeny Prigozhin, the former leader of the Wagner Group, caused quite the stir in June 2023 when he rose in revolt against Putin and the then Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu. Wagner took control of the important supply hub of Rostov-on-Don before coming close to Moscow and backing off thanks to a deal brokered by Belarusian dictator Alexander Lukashenko. Prigozhin conveniently died in a plane accident a few months later. The swift end of the mutiny reinforced Putin's power in the short term, but he was strangely absent during the crisis. This absence and the seeming need for Lukashenko to end the revolt might have planted a seed of Putin's weakness in the minds of Russia's ruling elites. Those seeds were dormant when Russia appeared to be succeeding, but things are now different thanks to Ukraine's continued holding of Russian territory. There will be significant military, economic, and geopolitical consequences that come with this new reality. The inability to quickly expel Ukrainian troops from the Kursk and Belgorod oblasts has signaled much greater weakness on Putin's part than was the case a year ago when Ukraine's counteroffensives in Zaporizhia and Donbass were stalling. Now with Ukraine in Russian territory and the ruble in trouble again, there are more signs of trouble at home. The first sign has already materialized. A man named George Sikrevsky made news on August 14th. Sikrevsky is the leader of another Russian private military company called Paladin. Before that, he served in the KGB and the Soviet Army. During that time, he was involved in activities that are still classified. Paladin might not be as famous as the Wagner Group, but the unit has similar experiences. It's seen action in Africa where it protects strategic objectives. As a loyal instrument of Russian foreign policy and a fellow KGB man, Sikrevsky does not appear to be the type to turn on Putin, but he did just that in a call to action last month. Our country is not just on the brink of disaster or already right next to it. Our country is already in trouble. In big trouble. Drones are flying all over central Russia, right up to Moscow and St. Petersburg. They even attacked the Kremlin. Our Black Sea fleet is being pushed out. It's being pushed out as if we are not a great power with a great fleet, but some third-rate country. Our air force is practically not working because it's also being pushed out. We are standing in the same positions that we took more than 2 years ago, and partly in those to which we retreated. The population is dying out, becoming impoverished, drinking itself to death. No one cares. All they have time to do is bring in migrants. And all this was done by the so-called president, the great Putin. After a lengthy denunciation of corrupt and incompetent officers in the Russian army, Sikrevsky concluded, "To those who are in the trenches, you know very well what kind of indecency is happening there right now. You know very well the faces that are mocking you and your relatives. We call on everyone to join our union to save our country." Sikrevsky took a big risk in denouncing Putin, and even more so for issuing a call to action against him. His words were supposedly spread widely to Russia's elites and likely came only because he knew that some of his peers in the military and civilian spheres, at least privately, shared his feelings. Russia is a country with a history of regime changes in the wake of wars not going well. The loss in the Russo-Japanese War nearly toppled Tsar Nicholas II. The Russian front collapsed in World War I and resulted in 2 revolutions that ultimately led to the Bolshevik takeover of the country. Putin faces a dilemma that wielders of tyrannical power have faced throughout history. They use cutthroat methods to acquire and maintain power, often requiring the assistance of cutthroat allies who have an interest in seeing the regime's continuation. However, the man at the head of this regime can only ensure his own survival by catering to these interests. If they feel that their interests are no longer being served, the mobsters will turn on their boss, who will be left hoping that comfortable retirement will be the worst thing that happens to him. The longer Ukraine continues to hold territory in Russia, the more likely it will be that things go wrong for Putin far beyond the front lines. More military reserves mean more casualties and a demand for manpower in Russia, which can only be answered through more conscription, by taking troops off the lines in Ukraine, or both. Ukrainian successes and Russian failures on its own soil also increase the likelihood that Ukraine will be able to use Western weapons against military targets near Moscow and St. Petersburg, as Western leaders increasingly realize Putin's threats are bluffs. Meanwhile, more shows of Russian weakness mean a higher likelihood of states that had once been amenable to Russia, like India and China, begin to reassess their interests. The more all of these things go wrong at once, the weaker Putin becomes internally. At some point, the machinery keeping him in power will decide that it's losing more than it's gaining. It's unlikely that Ukraine will be able to defeat Russia outright on the battlefields of eastern Ukraine, and vice versa, but all wars are political affairs first and foremost. If Putin loses political power, Ukraine wins. It seems that the Ukrainians have calculated that this is their best strategy and have taken action accordingly. If it only took weeks of having boots on the ground in Russia to topple one of the regime's dominoes, Kyiv might have a good reason to be optimistic about broader gains for every inch of ground it takes on Russian soil. What do you think is coming next in Russia as Ukraine continues its operations in Kursk and Belgorod? What military, political, economic, and diplomatic consequences its continual presence there bring?
2024 was supposed to be the year of recovery, but for who? Putin's relentless push to swell the ranks has made the Russian army one of the largest in the world, with 1.3 million active soldiers and another 2 million in reserve. But this show of force came at a steep cost on the Russian home front, one that Russia is about to pay in blood. Meanwhile, Zelensky kept Ukraine's plans for the latter half of 2024 shrouded in secrecy, offering only cryptic hints of a strategy in motion. NATO, after months of waiting, finally began delivering F-16 fighter jets in July, following Congress's approval of a $60 billion aid package in April. The first half of the year was spent preparing for war, the second half unleashing it. And yet, despite Russia's overwhelming numbers and resources, Putin is teetering on the brink of a catastrophic defeat. Russia reinvigorated its efforts to invade and occupy Ukraine in May 2024. On paper, Russia had plenty of avenues to win the war. It had the manpower advantage as a result of relentless conscription campaigns and the fact that Ukraine had a little less than half of Russia's population to begin with. It had the material advantage, being perhaps the only country that produced the ammunition that the Soviet-era tanks and artillery batteries used, and which were the main military equipment on both sides of the war. The US Congress had previously spent months bickering about sending more aid to Ukraine, believing that funding the war would be a pointless effort. Yet throughout all that, the so-called summer invasion was a resounding failure for Russia, perhaps due to the bizarre choices made by the Russian military command. You see, apart from the initial blitzkrieg attempt at reaching Kyiv from the north, which was repelled within a few months of the invasion starting, Russia has focused most of its efforts on occupying the eastern and southern points of Ukraine. The former was a relatively obvious target, with Russia already annexing Crimea 10 years ago and having a much greater geopolitical presence in the surrounding Ukrainian regions to begin with. The latter was done to prevent Ukraine from being able to export goods, as Ukraine is a significant grain exporter across the Black Sea. Therefore, most of 2023 was spent with Russia putting more pressure on the eastern side of the Russo-Ukrainian front, occupying the Donetsk region. The Russian army's next goal in the area for 2024 was naturally going to be the largest city in the region, that being Pokrovsk. The 60,000 population city is the transportation hub between the eastern front and the rest of Ukraine, so Russia was trying to capture the city as part of the 2024 summer campaign made sense in a way. However, what happened was nothing short of a moment of impulsiveness. Instead of going for the eastern front, the main Russian force during the May and June campaigns was focused on the northern city of Kharkiv. That's the same city and the same region that was under siege in the first few months of the invasion all the way back in 2022, and which the Ukrainians retook by September of that year. Additionally, rather than pressing into the Kharkiv region with armored vehicles and tanks supported by long-range artillery strikes, Russia heavily favored infantry-based tactics. From the reports in the area, Russia used cobbled-together turtle tanks, which were unwieldy armored vehicles, with the goal of absorbing as much Ukrainian fire as possible and giving more breathing room to the infantry forces. For infantry, Russians turned to equipping troops with motorcycles to give them more maneuverability and speed compared to traditional armored vehicles. Apparently, the goal of the summer campaign was to cover as much ground as possible, as fast as possible, using as little of Russia's heavy armor as necessary. This could stem from the widespread shortage of tanks that Russia could allocate to the campaign in the first place. In 2023, it became apparent that Russia was running out of modern armor. Russia's most modern battle tank was the T-90, effectively an upgraded version of the old T-72 that was manufactured throughout the Soviet era. However, Ukraine has been able to deal with the T-90s via the gifted tanks from the West and by exploiting the tank's critical weak spot under the chassis, the autoloader. Unlike the Western tanks, the T-90, as well as the T-72, uses an auto-loading mechanism that also stores excess sensitive ammunition, which is located under the turret. If an explosion, such as the one delivered by mine or drone, the latter of which Ukraine has become bona fide experts in, hits the turret, there's a chance that all the stored ammunition detonates and obliterates the tank. By removing Russia's more modern tanks from the equation, both Russia and Ukraine have mainly relied on the contingent of older Soviet-era tanks like the T-72s, T-62s, and even older T-55s. The Western sanctions on Russia have prevented it from getting more modern pieces of equipment, which resulted in Russia being forced to salvage or re-equip Soviet tanks to use in the war. Even with that, a bulk of the tanks were being sent to the Eastern Front. That led to the strange situation where Russia has mainly used infantry tactics to make headway into the Kharkiv region. For the first few weeks of the summer offensive, Russia did see some progress, managing to eke some 10 miles into Ukrainian territory, but nowhere near close to the city of Kharkiv itself. The losses that Russia accumulated over the summer offensive were staggering. According to Ukrainian intelligence, the invading force contained between 30,000 and 70,000 soldiers, leading to a significant increase in daily losses incurred by Russia. Ukrainska Pravda, a news outlet that tracks daily losses, suggests that Russia has been losing over 1,200 soldiers per day across all fronts throughout the summer offensive. Over the course of May and June, the months with the most activity on the newly opened Kharkiv front, Russia suffered around 70,000 casualties. That's a significant blow to the already failing Russian morale and attempts to improve the troop count, with many comparing the Russian tactics to feeding soldiers into a meat grinder for no apparent reason. So what was the ultimate goal behind the summer offensive? Some strategists suggest that Russia was confident that the lower estimate of 30,000 troops would be enough to dig deep into Ukrainian territory and capture Kharkiv. After all, Ukraine itself has focused its efforts on fortifying the Eastern Front, so it wasn't out of the realms of possibility to consider that Kharkiv would be sparsely defended as a result. Other tacticians believe that the Kharkiv offensive was meant as a diversion. Its goal was to make Ukraine think that Russia was putting most of its efforts into occupying Kharkiv, forcing the Ukrainian army to change gears and fall back from the Eastern Front to defend the north. Either way, Russia was planning to use Kharkiv as a means to an end, with that end being making more progress on the Eastern Front. However, all the Russians ended up doing was falling into a massive trap.
The Kharkiv invasion, ill-equipped and poorly planned as it was, turned out to be a massive failure. Despite early gains, Russia couldn't maintain the momentum, and Ukraine managed to reinforce the area with minimal setbacks on the Eastern Front. The Russian army was forced to retreat relatively quickly, allowing Ukraine to retake the occupied villages near the border and proclaim victory in that battle. Granted, Russia managed to gain some territory in the east, roughly 400 square miles, but it came at the cost of 70,000 soldiers, significant losses in tanks and other armored vehicles, and the main target of Pokrovsk was still relatively safe. And remember, by the time Russia started the summer invasion, Ukraine still had yet to receive the financial and military aid that the US Congress announced in April. When the summer offensive was over, that money and equipment started to trickle into the country. Now it was up to Ukraine to make the move. And so we come to the beginning of August 2024, when Ukraine made one of the most surprising yet effective advances in the past 18 months of warfare, the invasion of Kursk. On paper, the Kursk region should have the same amount of defenses on the Russian side as Kharkiv did on the Ukrainian side. Both regions are on the border between the two countries and therefore have a high potential of being used as part of the northern front in the war. However, Ukraine went in with a much smaller contingent, some reports suggesting around 1,000 troops only, and completely swept through Russia's defenses in the area. More troops followed soon, creating an organized yet mobile invading force that could occupy one village after another without setting down permanent defenses. Ultimately, Ukraine's success came down to a few factors. One, Ukraine has managed to provide a much more effective cover and pressure via artillery fire in Kursk. The strikes focused on key military fortifications and infrastructure that could be used to reinforce the area with more troops. Satellite images of the region showed a few bridges and vital roads being destroyed throughout the region, effectively cutting the Russian army off from the mainland. Second, Russia has vastly overestimated the effectiveness of its ground forces in the area. As a result, most of the troops stationed throughout the Kursk region ended up being fresh recruits who have only had several weeks of combat training and were not exactly meant to fight on the front lines. What ended up happening with the new troops was a wave of Russians surrendering as the Ukrainian army advanced from one village to the next. Within the first week of the invasion, a Ukrainian prison that was housing prisoners of war reported processing 300 captured Russian soldiers, more than 80% of whom were newer conscripts. According to some estimates, the actual count of the prisoners could inflate by several hundred in mere weeks. Russia has also heavily underplayed the importance and the extent of the Kursk region. The initial reports made by the Russian Ministry of Defense suggested that the invading army had only 300 soldiers. The subsequent report even went so far as to proclaim that the Ukrainian troops were being actively pushed back by the local troops. This was a bold-faced lie to cover up the utter failure of the Russian war machine to account for the mere possibility that Ukraine was suddenly gaining ground. Soon after, more accurate reports by the Ukrainian and Western intelligence came in, with surveys of the actual damage dealt in the Kursk region. They suggested that the invasion has caused between 120,000 and 200,000 residents of the area to become displaced, with Ukraine managed to occupy dozens of villages and slowly advance toward the administrative center of Kursk. 3 weeks after the incursion, the Russian response is still uncertain. For the most part, Russia continues to downplay the effect of the Kursk incursion on the actual progress of the war. The country's artillery has managed to slow down the Ukrainian forces and has thus far prevented them from going deeper into enemy territory. On the other hand, Russia has also scrambled to create trenches roughly 25 miles into the occupied territory. These trenches don't seem like they're going to be used as defensive positions by the Russians, though. Based on Russian actions so far and the state of the military in the region, it's likely that Ukraine can take control of these trenches and use them as stopgaps in a prolonged counter-invasion of Russia. On the other hand, Russia has reinvigorated its efforts on the Eastern Front. Reports from the last 2 weeks of August 2024 suggested that Russian forces have come as close as 7 miles to the city of Pokrovsk. The Ukrainian government has urged the residents of the city to evacuate, but has encountered significant issues with moving large numbers of civilians so close to the renewed front lines. The reason for that is Russia's complete lack of care for Ukrainian civilians. Even before the newest waves of fighting, the Russian army has displayed utter ruthlessness when it comes to dealing with civilians. Throughout the war, Russia has frequently targeted primarily civilian areas with missiles and drones, forcing the Ukrainian military to heavily invest and ask for anti-air defensive systems, such as the US-made Patriots. The Russian airstrikes were focusing on Ukrainian hospitals, which housed both civilian and military casualties, an act which is against the Geneva Convention and international humanitarian law. In contrast, the Ukrainian army has made efforts to minimize civilian casualties in Kursk, working alongside international humanitarian organizations to provide aid to the people who remained in the area.
The reinforcements and infrastructure that were struck by the Ukrainian airstrikes primarily had a military use, preventing Russia from reinforcing the region. Furthermore, Ukraine has shown no long-term goals to control the area it occupied during the Kursk incursion, at least according to the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry. This is unlike Russia's persistent efforts to annex parts of Ukraine, trying to claim the Donetsk region. President Zelensky has suggested that he's ready to present a plan to the US that outlines the terms of a peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine. The invasion of Kursk is therefore meant to drive down the narrative that Ukraine is not yet ready to yield to Russia and will continue to go on the offensive. By doing so, Ukraine can get a significant edge over Russia. First, the extent of the invasion in Kursk showcases how much Ukraine can accomplish in a relatively short time with restricted access to Western resources. While Russia has managed to occupy roughly 400 square miles of Ukrainian land between January and July 2024, Ukraine currently holds some 500 square miles of the Kursk Oblast territory, all acquired within the span of 3 weeks. This gives Zelensky the confidence to ask for more resources, particularly long-range missiles, fighter jets and artillery, which would allow Ukraine to press deeper into Russia by advancing on the newly made Kursk front. This will allow Ukraine to force Russia to back away from the Eastern Front and rethink whether Kursk is an unimportant part of the wider war. Additionally, the recent allotment of aid primarily comes in the form of ammunition and anti-air missiles, which have seen consistently positive results on the Eastern Front throughout the Kursk invasion. One of the most recent Russian attacks on the Eastern Front has been a devastating airstrike with 127 missiles and 109 drones launched, according to an Al Jazeera report. Ukraine's air defenses have managed to take out 102 missiles and 99 drones, heavily reducing the damage Russia could inflict on Ukrainian military compounds, infrastructure, and even civilian areas. Russia has been getting bolder in what it terms acceptable military targets, with one drone hitting a dam only miles upstream from Kyiv. The dam suffered minimal damage and remained intact, but it showcased that Russia will not relent until it completely dominates Ukraine. To that end, the current incursion of Kursk provides a twofold solution to this problem. First, Ukraine has started to ramp up its drone attacks as well, considering that the country has heavily invested in creating a domestic military drone industry and has received long-range missiles from NATO. The current effective range of the Ukrainian drones is estimated to be roughly 1,100 miles away from the Ukrainian border. By pushing further into Russian territory, Ukraine can create a favorable position to start launching more precision strikes directly at Moscow. Until now, Moscow has been relatively untouched by the conflict. The conscription efforts were disproportionately targeting rural areas, especially people who belong to Russia's many national minorities. A PBS News interview in 2023 suggested that 6 out of 10 regions with the highest death tolls were in Siberia and the Far East, and that men from certain minorities were as much as 75 times more likely to die from the war than Muscovites. In contrast, Moscow has seen a significant brain drain in the first months of the war, with around 900,000 Russians leaving the country by the end of 2022. Many of them were blue-collar, highly skilled workers, which has largely stripped the capital of people who view the war negatively. If Ukraine manages to put direct military pressure on Moscow and give the capital a feeling of what it's like to be in an active war, it's highly likely that the public sentiment on the war will change. Even in an authoritarian regime such as Putin's, this could lead to a significant ideological shift within the country that could spell doom for the nation's leadership and geopolitical relations. But let's go back to the second reason why Ukraine's Kursk invasion can solve its air defense problems. The army's ability to withstand hostile airstrikes while advancing in enemy territory gives Zelensky more sway to ask for direct military equipment from NATO countries, primarily in the form of Patriots and other anti-air defense systems. These can prove vital if Ukraine wants to maintain its momentum and pressure Russia without receiving air retaliation. And Ukraine has one more ace up its sleeve for aerial supremacy. The F-16s have arrived. After months of training, NATO's shipment of 65 F-16s has been deemed ready to take flight over Ukraine, piloted by Ukrainian fighter pilots. The F-16 is one of the most modern fighter jets available to both sides of the conflict. Russia has the Su-27s, which were specifically made to counter the threat of the F-16 but failed to do so. The addition of F-16s aims to degrade what little is left of Russia's hope to control Ukraine via its airspace. This is why Zelensky has also been adamant about asking for even more fighter jets to defend the country. The small victory that the Ukrainian army achieved in Kursk can be seen as a precursor and a catalyst of what can be done in the wider context of the war itself. But why is airspace control vital in turning the tide of war? The answer lies in Russia's saber-rattling. During 2022 and 23, NATO efforts to end the war by providing Ukraine with more advanced military equipment have been met with resistance from Russia.
Putin has frequently alluded to the possibility that there's a line that NATO cannot cross, or it risks impeding on Russia's sovereignty, which is quite rich considering the goal of the special military operation. Russia has frequently used its reserve of nuclear weapons to prevent NATO from providing full support to Ukraine under the pretense that Ukraine would use the weapons to invade Russia in turn. While that moment has happened, Ukraine has managed to occupy a portion of Russia. The Russian response was to first deny the claims, then fabricate increasingly bold lies about the state of the invasion, followed by a half-hearted attempt at securing the Kursk region while also pressuring Ukraine on the existing Eastern Front. Therefore, it became even more unlikely that Russia will use nuclear weaponry against Ukraine and NATO. NATO's strategy so far has been to arm Ukraine just enough so it can prolong the war, but avoid crossing Russia's lines in the sand, so to speak. The Kursk incursion and lack of Russia's nuclear responses might just give NATO the go-ahead to approve more ambitious plans to provide more comprehensive aid to Ukraine. This means that Putin is losing all his leverage against the West, and that NATO can start putting more pressure to end the war in Ukraine's favor. But there's yet another factor to consider when discussing the current war events: economies. Both Russia and Ukraine have had to heavily change how their economies function in wartime. Ukraine is using nearly $350 billion worth of financial and military equipment aid from Europe and the US to keep itself running. More specifically, the country had previously suffered greatly from Russia being able to control the Black Sea with its navy, a military force that Ukraine is sorely lacking in. However, Ukraine managed to score yet another significant victory on that front, mainly via drone warfare. Starting with the spring of 2022, Ukraine has made several attempts to create drones that were specifically made for sea-to-sea warfare. The sea-deployed Magura V5 drone was designed to deliver an explosive payload by swimming rather than flying. The first public showcases of the Magura V5s were made later in the year, damaged Russia's newest Black Sea Fleet flagship and a minesweeper. Emboldened by the success, Ukrainians began to use the drones more offensively and supported their sea-based attacks with traditional air-to-surface strikes deeper into Russia's territory to cut off access to the Black Sea. The result was 26 sunk or damaged ships in the Russian fleet, forcing Russia to withdraw from Sevastopol in October 2023. This allowed Ukraine to reopen some of its previous maritime trading routes and start exporting across the Black Sea. By August 2024, Ukrainska Pravda reported that the reopened Black Sea corridor had been used by 2,300 ships over the past year, and that grain exports were slowly starting to reach pre-war numbers. This effectively means the country doesn't solely need to rely on financial aid to get its economy up and running. In contrast, Russia's economy has become more isolationist than ever. In response to the invasion, the EU has stopped Russia's oil and gas exports. In response, Russia has been forced to find new clients, namely China and India. But the deal with China comes with significant caveats. The price of natural gas was purported to be roughly half of what Russia was achieving on the Western market, limiting its options to create income from selling natural resources. The US has also posed significant economic sanctions on Russia, preventing the country from trading in US dollars or obtaining any technology or equipment that could be construed as being used militarily. The short-term effect of the sweeping trade changes was that China and Russia achieved record trade volume in 2023 at over $240 billion. However, even that doesn't seem like it'll work out in Russia's favor in the long run. While the total trade has managed to grow slightly, the oil trade has actually seen a decline in 2024 so far compared to 2023, and the prices are unstable. Furthermore, Russia's economy has evidently gone all in on supplying the war effort. The 2024 budget has allocated around 39% of the government funding to military and national defense, a staggering figure compared to the rest of the world. Russia has now one of the highest military spending figures, both in total and as a percentage of GDP, 6%, compared to the US's 3.4%, China's 1.7%, and NATO's 2.7% average. This can be attributed to the country's blossoming energy sector, which is again a response to Russia's heavy reliance on exporting oil and natural gas. The energy sector has the potential to create an even greater imbalance in employment opportunities for Russian citizens. If the energy sector is more lucrative than, let's say, manufacturing or agriculture, Russia will see a significant shift in energy companies gaining employees at the expense of other industries. The newly minted middle and upper classes will create a demand for the service sector, which will again drain the less desirable industrial sectors. But the process can only continue as long as the energy sector continues to grow, and that growth isn't sustainable. Furthermore, the downfall of the other sectors will force Russia to depend on importing more and more from neighboring countries, typically China or the former Soviet nations like Kazakhstan and Belarus. Ultimately, this gives China far greater control of Russia's geopolitics than Putin might feel comfortable with. If China decides to pull the plug on Russian exports as a result of US pressure, Russia's economy might be facing a downturn, which will halt the country's militaristic ambitions. When the invasion started, and over the course of the following 2 years, Russia was hoping to use its resource advantage to drain Ukraine's resources and win by plowing over what was left of the country when the latter's military was annihilated. However, the recent events in Kursk have shown that Ukrainians have plenty of fight left in them, and that the world no longer has much to fear from Russia's nuclear arsenal. With Russia's military proving to be at an increasing disadvantage compared to Ukrainian troops bolstered by NATO, Russia's economy propped up by China and already past the point of no return, and Putin unable to manipulate NATO into standing down, Russia has pretty much run out of options. We might see that the closing months of 2024 and the beginning of 2025 become the effective end of the Russo-Ukrainian war. If that happens, Putin is unlikely to have much ground to make demands for peace will be enforced on Russia, and it might spell doom for Russia as a country itself. But what do you think? Does the Kursk invasion of Russia mean that Ukraine is on a quick path to victory, or will the war continue for a few more years?
1,000 days. That's how long Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine has dragged on. 1,000 days into a war that was supposed to last just 3, and Russia finds itself in freefall. Ukraine, against all odds, has turned the tide, not just holding the line, but grinding Russia's military into dust. Staggering troop losses, shattered equipment, and crumbling morale paint a grim picture for the Kremlin. Putin's grand gamble has backfired spectacularly, and the cracks in his war machine are now impossible to ignore. But what sealed Russia's fate? The answer lies in a daring moment that reshaped the battlefield: the Kursk incursion. On August 6, 2024, Ukraine launched a surprise offensive into Russia's Kursk Oblast, catching Moscow completely off guard. Ukrainian forces quickly breached Russian defenses, capturing dozens of square miles of Russian territory within the first few days. By the end of the first week, Ukraine had secured around 386 square miles of land, and Russian authorities had been forced to declare a state of emergency. In other words, it took Ukrainian troops only a week to show the world just how fragile Russia's position truly is. Naturally, for Russia, this incursion was a humiliating blow. After all, we aren't talking about a border skirmish, we're talking about a full-scale breach into Russian territory. A breach that awarded Putin a not-so-flattering title: the first Russian leader in modern history to have foreign troops on Russian soil. However, the Ukrainian troops haven't been just holding ground, they've been inflicting serious damage on Russia's military infrastructure. Ukrainian artillery and drones have been hammering Russian positions, leaving a trail of destroyed vehicles, tanks, and equipment. But that's not even the worst part. Thousands of Russian soldiers have also been sent to an early grave, with each day claiming more of the country's already strained forces. To put it simply, it's a slaughter for Russia. A slaughter that shows no signs of slowing down. In fact, it only seems to be getting worse. The deadliest days for Russian troops are no longer early 2022 when the invasion first began. They're now in November 2024, as the battlefield becomes more unforgiving with every passing day. But words alone don't do justice to the scale of these losses. The numbers tell the true story of Russia's unraveling. According to the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces, Russia has lost 725,740 troops from February 24, 2022 to November 20, 2024. That's nearly 750,000 lives shattered in less than 3 years, and the toll keeps rising. As of November 20th, the deadliest day for Russian troops was November 11th, when they lost nearly 2,000 soldiers, or 1,950 to be precise. To put this into perspective, that's almost as many military personnel the United States lost during 20 years of war in Afghanistan. Yes, you heard that right. Between October 7, 2001 and August 30, 2021, the US suffered a total of 2,324 combat deaths. Russia nearly matched this number in casualties in just 24 hours. The scale of this bloodshed truly defies comprehension. But November 11th was no isolated incident. The record that was broken that day was set the day before, on November 10th, which was also reported as Russia's deadliest day since the beginning of the invasion, with 1,770 losses. The previous record, 1,740 Russian losses, was set on May 13th, mere days after Russia launched an offensive operation in Ukraine's Kharkiv Oblast. But this doesn't mean that the early days of November were merciful for Russia. On November 8th, the country lost 1,660 troops. On November November 4th, it was 1,260. November 1st claimed 1,270. You get the picture. October, previously the deadliest month for Russian forces, recorded 41,980 casualties, an average of roughly 1,350 per day. Yet November is shaping up to surpass even that grim milestone, with the last few days in November recording losses well over 1,500 a day. November 19th, 1,690. November 18th, 1,610. November 17th, 1,560. November 16th, 1,640. November 15th, 1,650. November 14th, 1,520. November 13th, 1,690. November 12th, 1,770. This devastation has led many to label what's unfolding in Kursk as nothing short of a massacre. Videos circulating online show hundreds of Russian vehicles obliterated, some with troops still inside, highlighting the utter futility of Moscow's repeated assaults. Of course, Russia wouldn't be Russia if it didn't try to spin things around. Russian soldiers have also been posting videos and photos of their battleground successes in Kursk. One such instance involves a Russian soldier proudly posing next to a Ukrainian Leopard 2 tank that his unit supposedly hit and captured. Given that Leopard 2 tanks are highly advanced and relatively scarce in Ukraine's arsenal, this was quite the achievement, right? Well, not quite. Upon closer inspection, this tank turned out to be nothing more than a decoy. A well-crafted decoy, but a decoy nonetheless. This bizarre display of desperation perfectly sums up the contrast between Russia's propaganda and the reality on the ground. This contrast has become so significant that Russian commanders have reportedly been arrested for exaggerating battlefield gains. According to recent reports, these arrests stem from Moscow's growing frustration with the gap between the glowing victories portrayed in state media and the catastrophic losses being suffered in Kursk. In a shocking turn of events, several mid-level and senior officers were accused of fabricating reports to appease higher-ups, overstating territorial gains and inflating Ukrainian losses. The goal of these false claims was to shield the commanders from criticism and disciplinary actions. However, they only managed to fuel the Kremlin's delusions about the state of the war. Yet another major miscalculation. So now, with Kursk turning into a disaster of unprecedented scale, the Kremlin's crackdown on its own commanders showcases the chaos and paranoia within Russia's military leadership. However, the fact that Russian commanders felt compelled to do this in the first place exposes another thing. The Russian chain of command is completely fractured. But as the Kursk debacle continues, no amount of doctor reports or arrests can mask the truth of Russia's mounting failures. But it's not just manpower that's being bled dry. Russia's equipment is also taking a brutal beating. According to the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces, as of November 20th, Russia has lost an astounding 9,390 tanks, 19,119 armored vehicles, and 20,681 artillery systems. These losses also extend to Russia's aerial and naval fleet, with 369 airplanes, 329 helicopters, and 28 ships and boats destroyed. Even drones, a crucial tool for modern warfare, haven't escaped unscathed. Over 19,202 Russian unmanned aerial vehicles have been taken out of action so far. November alone has added significantly to these staggering totals. In just one day, November 19th, Ukrainian forces reportedly took out 8 tanks, 27 armored personnel vehicles, 49 artillery systems, and 91 drones. And remember the deadliest day for the Russians, November 11th? Well, that single day claimed 23 tanks and 81 armored personnel vehicles. November added a couple more dismal milestones to Russia's depressing track record. As of November 20th, Russia has officially lost over 1,000 anti-aircraft systems. While Russia passed 4 digits in this department, it's quickly approaching a devastating 5-digit number in total. A total of 29,648 vehicles and fuel tanks have been lost so far, with November 19th adding another 100 to the tally. It's only a matter of time before Russia's vehicle losses surpass the mind-blowing 30,000 mark. Each new day seems to bring another chapter of devastation to Moscow's war effort, and the worst part is that Russia cannot possibly replace these vital resources at the pace required. Now, you might wonder, isn't Russia's economy on a war footing? With all the resources pouring into the defense industry, how is it possible that it can't keep up? Well, the answer is simple. The losses are just too big. Russia's production lines, stretched to their limits, simply can't match the ferocious pace of destruction. Take large caliber cannon barrels, for instance. According to OLIGARCHS, a Dutch open-source intelligence defense analysis website that records documented equipment losses, Russia loses over 320 tank and artillery cannon barrels per month. However, Russia's 2 rotary forges, critical for producing these components, can churn out only 20 barrels monthly. That's a replacement rate of less than 7%. A catastrophic mismatch. Worse still, Russia can't expand its production capacity because the skills and equipment required are controlled by specialist firms abroad, such as Austria's GFM, and given the sanctions, the prospect of acquiring any necessary parts is close to zero. Fighting vehicles tell a similar story. Since the war began, Russia has lost roughly 155 infantry fighting vehicles, according to OLIGARCHS. Russian defense manufacturers can produce about 200 per year, or approximately 17 per month, which means they have the capacity to replenish these losses in less than a year. However, sustaining this level of production while also dealing with other categories of equipment losses and maintaining combat operations stretches Russian industry to its limits. Even with the older models scavenged from Soviet-era stockpiles, these reserves won't last indefinitely, raising questions about Russia's ability to keep up over the long term. Russia's artillery production has reportedly tripled to an annual rate of 3 million shells, which sounds impressive. Well, that is until you consider its consumption rate. While Russia is no longer firing the 12 million rounds expended in 2022, estimates suggest its current usage still far outstrips production. This has forced Moscow to rely heavily on imports, such as North Korean shells, which now make up nearly 50% of the artillery used in Ukraine. But shells aren't the only thing coming from North Korea. Beyond artillery, North Korea has provided long-range rocket and artillery systems, including 50 domestically produced 170mm M1989 self-propelled howitzers and 20 upgraded 240mm multiple-launch rocket systems. These contributions mark a deepening military partnership between Moscow and Pyongyang, one that shows just how destroyed Russia's defense capabilities are. However, North Korean contributions to the equipment department weren't the most controversial. North Korean troops have arrived in Russia too. As of early November, Pyongyang has deployed around 11,000 soldiers to bolster Russia's efforts in the Kursk Oblast. At the same time, reports suggest that this number could increase in the coming weeks. Divided into assault and support units, these North Korean forces are now integral to Russia's strategy in the region. Yet these troops face significant vulnerabilities. They're poorly trained and equipped, lack battle experience, and don't even understand the language spoken around them. That's why many military experts have labeled them as nothing more than cannon fodder for the Russians. Of course, their involvement speaks volumes about the sheer scale of Moscow's manpower losses. It's obvious that Putin is desperately trying to plug the gaps, as Russia's domestic recruitment and conscription efforts are failing to sustain the war. This makes the growing cooperation between Russia and North Korea far from the triumph Putin's propagandists might claim. No, this partnership reeks of desperation. Faced with battlefield attrition rates it can't match, and an economy teetering under the weight of war, Moscow has turned to one of the few nations willing to defy sanctions openly. Speaking of Russia's economy, it also has "finished" written all over it, just like Putin's efforts in Ukraine. Sure, on paper this economy might look solid. Russia's gross domestic product, GDP, is growing. Unemployment has hit a historic low of 2.4% and wages have skyrocketed. But this rosy picture hides severe structural problems, driven by the so-called military Keynesianism, an unsustainable, war-fueled economic boost. The defense industry alone has absorbed 500,000 workers, while the armed forces require 30,000 fresh recruits each month to replace casualties. The labor market is so strained that defense firms have had to increase wages five-fold, pushing inflation to 8.68% as of October. These increased wages might attract workers, but they still come at a steep cost. Other sectors, particularly those vital to the civilian economy, are suffering from acute labor shortages. Meanwhile, Moscow's lavish military bonuses have created a financial black hole that the civilian economy simply can't fill. Perhaps that's why the Kremlin has resorted to one of its most cynical moves yet, slashing compensation for wounded soldiers. In a November 13th decree signed by Putin, Russia introduced a sliding scale for injury payouts, cutting what was once a flat payment of roughly $30,000 for any injury to a drastically reduced amount based on the severity of the wounds. Under the new system, only soldiers with the most catastrophic injuries, classified as Section 1 and including severe spinal damage, brain trauma, or life-threatening organ damage, will receive the full $30,000 or 3 million rubles. For less severe but still debilitating injuries such as concussions or gunshot wounds not affecting organs, the payout drops to 1 million rubles or $10,000. And for truly minor injuries, soldiers will receive a paltry 100,000 rubles or roughly $1,000, barely enough to cover basic medical treatment. This cost-cutting measure is a flagrant betrayal of the soldiers who have already paid an immense price for Putin's war. Soldiers suffering from fractures or other injuries that may have long-lasting impacts on their lives are now treated as though their suffering doesn't matter. What was once a gesture of recognition for the hardships of war is now reduced to a cold, calculated formula. But the real sting comes when you consider the financial realities in Russia. With the rising inflation rate of 8% to 8.68%, even the 100,000 rubles for minor injuries will quickly lose their value. This means that the soldiers won't even be taken care of in the short term, let alone in the long run. For many, this is a painful reminder that they are seen as nothing more than expendable resources. However, for Russia, this miserly move was the only viable option, as the war's costs spiral out of control. A 2024 analysis estimated that casualty payouts alone could amount to 2.3 trillion rubles, which is equivalent to $26 billion. That's roughly 6% of the entire national budget. Faced with this financial hemorrhaging, Moscow is choosing to save rubles at the expense of the very people it's sent to fight its war. But it gets worse. While the Kremlin trims compensation for injured troops, it continues to pour money into military bonuses. Lavish signing bonuses are swallowing resources that could otherwise be used to support those injured in service. Basically, Putin is sending a clear message to his people. You'll be paid handsomely to join, but once you leave, you're on your own. That's if you even get to leave. With this in mind, it's no wonder that morale has hit an all-time low among the Russian ranks. But unsurprisingly, Putin doesn't care. He's reportedly ordered the retake of Kursk at all costs. There's even a deadline for recapturing full control over the region, February 1, 2025. That's not even 2 weeks after the newly re-elected US President Donald Trump is set to be sworn into office. While the deadline was reportedly set up before Trump was re-elected, we can't help but wonder about the peculiar timing. With no regard for the lives of his soldiers, Putin is launching his forces forward with the same reckless abandon as at the start of the war. Column after column of Russian vehicles are pushing forward, charging headfirst into Ukraine's prepared defensive positions, despite the significant losses and strategic setbacks. So why the rush? Well, Putin is clearly trying to grab as much negotiating leverage as possible ahead of any potential diplomatic overture to the new US president. By regaining this territory, he will be able to present a victory of sorts to Trump, or at least a strong negotiating position to secure a deal that could be seen as a win for Moscow. But as you've already heard in this video, this all-out push isn't exactly going according to plan. And now, while President Joe Biden is still in office, the US has thrown a major wrench into Russia's plans. He's given Ukraine an all-clear to use US-supplied long-range missiles on Russian soil. This decision marks a monumental shift in the dynamics of the Russo-Ukrainian war. Biden's move, taken on November 17th, followed months of Ukrainian pleas for more potent weapons to strike Russian infrastructure and military targets beyond the front lines. At first, the US resisted providing such weapons for fear of escalating the conflict. However, Moscow's provocative actions, especially the deployment of North Korean soldiers among the 50,000 troops in Kursk, finally prompted a change in Washington's stance. The immediate impact of this policy change was felt just 2 days later, on November 19th, when Ukrainian forces reportedly launched an ATACMS missile against a key Russian munitions storage facility in Karachev, Bryansk Oblast. This attack marked the first time that the US-supplied long-range missiles were used on Russian soil. The target, a vital arsenal of Russia's main missile and artillery directorate, was reportedly destroyed in a dramatic explosion that sent fireballs soaring into the sky. Residents even captured the moment on video, showing the scale of the blast that rocked the region. Ukrainian officials confirmed that the munitions stored at this facility included artillery ammunition and anti-aircraft missiles, which are critical supplies for Russia's ongoing offensive. But why is this strike seen as a turning point in the war? Well, the ATACMS, with a range of up to 190 miles, allows Ukraine to target high-value Russian assets far from the front lines. The weapon's precision and capability to strike so deep within Russian territory will undoubtedly put immense pressure on Moscow's military infrastructure. However, it's important to note that this isn't just about military targets. It's about crippling Russia's ability to resupply its forces and sustain operations across multiple fronts, and this strike is just the beginning. The US decision has allowed Ukraine to incorporate long-range capabilities from other NATO allies, including France and the UK, into its arsenal. These nations are now preparing to send their own long-range missiles to to Ukraine, which notably include the Storm Shadow missiles, with a range of 310 miles. These missiles are designed to be launched from fighter jets, further increasing the diversity and reach of Ukraine's strikes within Russian territory. Other NATO allies are likely to follow suit. This means that Russia, which had become accustomed to operating with relative impunity on its own soil, will now be vulnerable to direct attacks that can cripple its logistics, command centers, and military resources. For Putin, this represents a nightmare scenario, a war on two fronts, one in Ukraine and one within his own borders. Moscow's response to this new reality has been predictably hostile. Russian officials, including Putin's press secretary Dmitry Peskov, have described the US decision as a dangerous escalation and a new phase of direct US involvement in the conflict. Peskov even warned that this would lead to greater tension between Russia and the West. As for Putin, he did what he does best: resort to the good old nuclear saber-rattling. This time, he dramatically lowered Russia's threshold for using nuclear weapons. Previously, Russia's nuclear doctrine allowed for the use of nuclear weapons only in case of a nuclear attack or an existential conventional attack, one that threatened the very survival of the state. However, the new doctrine now states that Russia could respond with nuclear weapons to any critical threat to its sovereignty and territorial integrity, even if the threat comes in the form of a conventional attack. This also includes situations where Russia's ally Belarus is attacked, or if a non-nuclear power, with support from a nuclear-armed state, engages in acts of war against Russia. Essentially, any attack by a NATO member or a joint attack involving NATO support could be deemed as an attack on Russia itself, thereby triggering the potential use of nuclear weapons. Of course, the timing of this decree is no coincidence. Putin wanted to make it clear that he views Biden's decision as a direct threat to Russia's security. The Kremlin has long warned that if NATO provided Ukraine with weapons capable of reaching Russian territory, it would consider NATO's involvement in the conflict as direct. In response, Russia wouldn't hesitate to escalate the situation. However, these repeated threats have always been just that: threats, empty words. This makes Putin's reaction just another desperate attempt to claw back some semblance of control over a situation that has increasingly slipped from his grasp. But unless nuclear weapons truly enter the game, Russia is, as it stands, finished. It's losing troops, equipment, and money at an unprecedented rate. Now, with the capability for long-range strikes in Ukrainian hands, it will also lose territory and infrastructure. In other words, it's truly game over. But what do you think? Is Russia truly done, or will it find a way to turn the tide? Will the West continue to provide the necessary support to Ukraine, or will the recent changes in the US leadership begin to fracture the coalition? China and Russia boast a strategic partnership with no limits, but beneath the surface, China is quietly positioning itself to take what it really wants: Siberia. While Putin clings to this shaky alliance, hoping for more support in his war efforts, China's true goal is to weaken Russia and reclaim the vast, resource-rich lands of the Russian Far East. With the population dwindling and its economy battered by war, Russia is vulnerable, and China knows it. Siberia, with its untapped resources and strategic value, is the real prize. For Xi Jinping, this isn't just about economic advantage, it's about fulfilling China's long-term vision of global power, the Great Rejuvenation. How far will China go? To unpack that, we first need to look at what the Great Rejuvenation truly means and why Siberia is central to this ambitious plan. Like Putin, Xi is a revanchist leader. China's period of weakness in the 19th and early 20th centuries haunts him as much as the fall of the Soviet Union haunts Putin. China lost much of its prestige and a lot of its territory during that time, and that includes territory in what is today Russia. How did that happen? Russia expanded eastward starting in the 16th century. Its long occupation by the Mongols in the medieval period still haunted it, and it desired to gain suitable frontiers to prevent such an occurrence from happening again. As it went east, it eventually encountered the Qing dynasty, which held land in Siberia, including modern Vladivostok, which was then called Haishanwai. The expanding Russian presence toward the Amur River eventually led to a series of sieges of a fortress called Albazino in 1686 and 1687. The Qing won these battles, which resulted in the 1689 Treaty of Nechynsk. This agreement guaranteed the lands in the upper Amur Valley to China, containing Russia's expansion in the Far East. However, the treaty was written in Latin and translated into Russian and Manchu separately, resulting in inconsistencies and ambiguous borders. The treaty nevertheless held until the late 1850s. By then, things were different, and the Qing dynasty had weakened considerably. In 1858, the Russian Empire forced the Treaty of Aigun onto the Qing. It reversed Nachinsk and gave Russia all the land north of the Amur River. 2 years later, at the Convention of Peking, Russia added the rest of what is now called Outer Manchuria to its borders, including Vladivostok, cutting off China from the Sea of Japan. The Communist Party of China, and Xi in particular, have often spoken against the unequal treaties forced on China during its Lake Qing weakness. It's used these unequal treaties and unfair treatment as a basis for expansive territorial claims, most notably with Taiwan. The Qing once ruled this island, but was forced to surrender it to Japan in 1895 after its defeat in the First Sino-Japanese War. It was returned to the Republic of China after Japan's defeat in World War II, but the People's Republic has never ruled it. Taiwan's new president, Lai Ching-te, broached this subject in a recent interview. He said that China's intention to take over Taiwan was not for reasons of territorial integrity. If that were the case, he wondered why Beijing hasn't raised the issue of the Treaty of Aigun with Russia. After all, using the same logic, China's territorial claim on Taiwan would essentially be the same as raising a territorial claim against Russia. However, China has demonstrated a willingness to use multiple tools to achieve its foreign policy ends. It can feel more confident about bullying Taiwan. With Russia, things need to be a little more subtle. China has in fact raised the issue of lost territories in more recent history. It and the Soviet Union had a conflict over these lands in 1969. China lost the border war and only came back to negotiations in 1991. These negotiations continued in the 1990s and 2000s as China and Russia began to improve their relations in response to the United States' emergence as the world's so-called hyperpower. China and Russia agreed on the dual aim of creating a multipolar world order, but to cooperate on this, they needed to resolve their border issues. Fortunately for Beijing and Moscow, a 2008 agreement was supposed to have officially demarcated the border between the two countries. There was some minor tinkering, but the borders between Russia and China, as we know them, did not substantially change. That might have been good for the two governments on the surface, but many Chinese citizens continue to object, wanting a restoration of the lost lands. This was seen most notably in 2020, when the Russian embassy in China celebrated the founding of Vladivostok. Chinese social media users were quick to express their outrage, remembering the history that the Russian embassy was now celebrating. Beijing has been listening to its people's revanchist concerns about the Russian Far East, at least in part. In more recent years, China's map makers have subtly raised the territorial issue again. In 2023, the Ministry of Natural Resources in Beijing released a map that raised eyebrows. Vladivostok was called by its old Chinese name. Other locales in the contemporary Russian Far East were referred to by Chinese names too. Officially, such maps must accurately reflect the scope of China's territory. As such, the disputed islands in the South China Sea are also called Chinese territory, as is Taiwan. The message was simple: these lands were Chinese and part of Chinese territory. Although this was just a map, the regaining of these lost lands would be fully within the aims of a historical revanchist like Xi Jinping. China's salami-slicing strategy has long included these tactics. Conveniently, the publication of the new map came at the time it did, when Russia was weakened and increasingly dependent on the senior player in the strategic partnership. But there are other reasons why China would cast covetous eyes on its former territory. China is a comparatively resource-poor country. This resource scarcity has been exacerbated by decades of communist mismanagement. Even something as simple as water is proving a problem for the Chinese, with demand growing amid shortages, dwindling volume in rivers like the Yangtze, and pollution. As a result of its resource scarcity, China must import much of what it needs, and many of these imports come by way of maritime choke points that the United States Navy and Air Force can block off. Siberia, though, is rich with the natural resources it needs. There are 220 million hectares of arable land there that have not yet been exploited. China is comparatively lacking. It only has 7% of the world's arable land to feed its enormous population, and much of that arable land has been degraded due to poor management. The Russian Far East's agricultural potential is naturally inviting. But it's not just land. The lands in the Russian Far East that China once controlled have many other enticements. There are precious metals like gold and silver, important minerals like zinc and iron ore, timber, hydrocarbons, and other food resources like fish. And these are all beyond the US military's reach. China has tapped these resources in the partnership with Russia, although not always to the extent they would have wanted. For example, Chinese enterprises hope to use the water in Lake Baikal, which holds about 20% of the world's unfrozen freshwater. In 2019, the Chinese hoped to create a bottling plant to take some of this water, which sparked large protests. Locals accuse the Chinese of wanting to ship the water to China to deprive them of access to the lake. A Russian court later halted the project. 2 years later, Chinese urban planners hoped to build a pipeline from Lake Baikal to the city of Lanzhou in an arid region of China. That project also never got off the ground. The controversy around the Lake Baikal investments gives the first clue about a potential conflict over these Far Eastern lands. The local Russians often didn't like the increasing Chinese presence in the area. Neither of the Lake Baikal plans came to fruition, in large part because of this distrust. However, China has an advantage in the great game of the region's resources: its demography. Russia's population will shrink from its present total of about 145 million to about 135 million by 2050. But this trend will hit the Russian Far East harder. This region has always been sparsely populated, and the fall of the Soviet Union made it even sparser as inhabitants moved west to Russia's European heartland seeking better opportunities. By 2050, there may only be about 5 million Russian nationals living in these far-flung territories. Across the river, there are 120 million Chinese. This has sparked nightmares on the Russian side of hordes of Chinese moving in and acquiring the territories through a huge tide of mass migration. These fears are partially related to ethnic biases. The Russians in the area typically view their Chinese counterparts with suspicion. International couples are uncommon. So far, the fears of a Chinese demographic takeover of the Russian Far East have proven misguided. In 2019, there were about 70,000 Chinese nationals living in the Russian Far East. This total actually declined from the high of about 200,000 in the 90s. Still, the Chinese have become an important presence in the Russian Far East economy, all with the encouragement of Beijing. Russian landowners have already widely leased farmland to Chinese nationals. Over 100,000 hectares have been rented out on 50-year leases. These plantations grow crops like soy that are then sent southwards. The Chinese nationals that work for Russian farmers in the area are also a welcome way for them to compensate for the shortage in native labor. Chinese nationals also often work in the timber industry and other Russian enterprises. For these Chinese workers, it's a welcome departure compared to the lack of opportunities in their rural and arid homelands. Moscow is aware of the native suspicion. It's made overtures of trying to strictly regulate the immigration of Chinese nationals into the Russian Far East as a way to placate these local concerns. One of the new requirements is that these foreign workers must pass a Russian language proficiency test before legally obtaining a temporary visa. However, Russian businesses often ignore the law with a wink and a nod from the local authorities. The local labor shortage means that the Chinese are the only convenient source to do the work that Russian businesses require. With Russian nationals either leaving for the West or being unwilling to do the work, these businesses feel like they have no other choice. For Russia, mitigating the population loss in Siberia is the only real way for it not to become dependent on Chinese labor and capital. Russia has in fact tried to benefit the inhabitants of the Far East with the new Ministry for the Far East. This ministry was created in 2011 with high hopes, but it squandered its resources on questionable projects, such as a bridge connecting Vladivostok to Russky Island. This $1.1 billion project resulted in the largest suspension bridge in the world. It's something of a local marvel. There's just one problem though. It's a bridge to nowhere and doesn't do much to benefit the hard-pressed locals. Why was such a money pit allowed to go forward? Well, since Russia's government is mainly based around enriching the people in it, it's lacking in long-term vision. Unsurprisingly, many of the funds allocated for regional development don't get to the Far East at all. They just line the pockets of the people that run the ministry. But what if this lack of support for the Far East is more of a feature than a bug? Russia's road network is also poor. This is a legacy of its imperial expansion. The road connects Vladivostok to Moscow, but not the Far Eastern regions with each other. It was a method designed to keep the population of Siberia subjugated and still has not changed. During Soviet times, there were various encouragements for people to move to the Far East, but those programs have dried up, and without any other support, it should not be surprising that many people have chosen to leave. Local companies that remain are often forced to maintain their own roads to get to their places of business. Many other enterprises that remain, particularly in the timber industry, are part of Putin's racket network, decreasing their competitiveness. In contrast, the Chinese have invested systematically in their region across the border, alleviating much of the poverty in the area and increasing its connectivity. Some of this connectivity moves beyond the national border. For example, China's phone network goes north of the Amur River. There are also many physical connections between China and the Russian Far East, with more on the way. There is a high-speed rail line that goes all the way to Beijing. This line has not received approval from Moscow, but it awaits extension in the region nevertheless. China also has an advantage in international financial markets. Because of the sanctions, Russian financing in the Far East often comes with interest rates of over 25%. Chinese financiers can lend money for interest rates of about 5%. Naturally, Russian businesses are more attracted to the Chinese money. There's even a dedicated forum for Russian businesses in Siberia seeking Chinese investment. It's held at Khabarovsk, a city of about 643,000 people, located 30 miles north of the border. Chinese nationals with money come up there, inspect Russian enterprises, and decide whether or not to lend money. For now, these Chinese workers in the Russian Far East are there on guest visas, but there is no guarantee that temporary status will continue forever. Russia has not been able to solve the migration and labor issues among its people in the region. Already, Chinese property developers are building more apartment units in the Russian Far East in anticipation that their countrymen will move north for work on a more permanent basis. Because of the increasing commercial activity between Russia and China, more Chinese students have begun studying the Russian language, including in Russian universities. A new elite is forming based on the assumption of greater interconnectivity between the Chinese economy and the Russian Far East. And there are pockets of deeper Chinese influence. In the Jewish autonomous region of the Russian Far East, there is an iron mine built, financed, and staffed exclusively by Chinese nationals that stay there permanently. This mine appears almost as a self-governing entity. There is little regulation by the Russian authorities. The mine awaits connection with the Chinese rail network in the area. Such a connection will come when the first bridge connecting the Russian and Chinese sides of the Amur River is complete. The continuing costs of the war in Ukraine mean that Russia's relative geopolitical power compared to China will get weaker. That means China will be able to exact greater and greater concessions from Russia, and we have already seen a major example. In June 2023, China was granted permission to use Vladivostok as a transit point for its domestic trade flows without paying customs duties to Russia. Russia had hoped to attract Japanese and South Korean investment in its effort to boost Vladivostok, but the war made such partnerships impossible. Now Russia is forced to turn to China for Vladivostok's economic prospects. The symbolism was not lost on Chinese social media users. It was the first time China had access to the port in 163 years. Russia felt that it could no longer exclude the Chinese. Is this a sign of things to come? The prospect of China creating a systematic policy of intrusion in the Russian Far East is a more distant one. For now, taking Taiwan and breaking the containment of the first island chain occupies top place in Beijing's foreign policy priorities. The Taiwan objective is not only a matter of prestige, but an attempt to secure the country's still much more voluminous maritime trade. Xi is also reported to be personally close with Putin, and this closeness has played a major part in strengthening the strategic partnership. Personal relationship may mean that more overt efforts to claim the lost territories will not come to fruition. China appears satisfied with its increasing economic presence there. There is no guarantee that this state of affairs will last forever, though. Xi might intend on remaining China's de facto emperor for life, but he will eventually be out of power. A future Chinese leader might even be more revanchist than Xi is. What if the old issues of the Qing dynasty come up then? Apart from incorporating Taiwan back into the mainland, China's other priority has been the recreation of the old Silk Road network that established its central place in the world's trade balance. This network was disrupted and dissolved after Europeans discovered the Americas and started to make direct sailing voyages to Asia. Economic power flowed westward as a result. China has aimed to bring that power back east, but its Belt and Road initiative has run into many problems. Aside from unsustainable debt, one of these problems is that there are simply too many players along the road from Asia to Europe, and the many territories it must traverse cannot be kept safe from terrorists, let alone the US military. The route between the Russian Far East and Europe, though, only involves one player. As the failures of the Belt and Road projects along the most used route of the old Silk Road begin to balloon and threaten the broader Chinese economy, China will be more pressured to find alternatives. The lost territories in the present Russian Far East could prove more tempting then. The Russian concession to China in Vladivostok might be the first of many. China might not aim for a Taiwan-style reincorporation of this lost territory. Nevertheless, the increased business with Chinese nationals and the region's dependence on Chinese labor and money mean that Beijing will have a growing influence in the territories that were once its own. Do not be surprised if one day, maybe after Xi is out of power, China asserts the need to protect its people in the Russian Far East from prejudicial treatment by some of the local authorities and inhabitants. By invading Ukraine, Russia cut itself off from the West. For Putin, this was fine, as he hoped to present a united front with China against the West. But when one lacks options, one's negotiating position becomes weaker. And when you have something that a former enemy of yours still wants, you need to be careful when you try to make that enemy a friend.
What do you think the future of the Russian Far East will look like? Will Russia have challenges holding on to its almost empty wilderness in the face of a much larger Chinese population that appears ready and eager to exploit the opportunities its vast resources have to offer?